Hi, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by some former guests and friends. I got Dr. Gerard Casey, Dr. Lou Markos, Thomas of Storytellers, and Matt of Logos Made Flesh. So I'll try to rotate the order of the questions to go around each of you. And after the individual's answer, then I'd like to open the question up to everybody. So please feel free to jump in, and hopefully we get a nice balance between chaos and order, if I might channel our Jordan Peterson. So the topic of discussion is obviously Jordan Peterson and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So just to begin, I want to ask you, Thomas, what did you think of Peterson's recent book? And do you think that he's come closer to the Christian faith, and how so, if that's the case?
Right. Yeah, I think I thought it was quite good. I quite enjoyed it. I think having read his previous book, I think certain sections did have some overlap with that book, but he definitely surprised me on certain rules or chapters, and I think especially the one on beauty. In a way, I think Beyond 12 Rules went beyond being a self-help book, pun intended. But more so, I think, than his previous book did. I think especially his emphasis on the vital importance of community for the individual, the indispensability of beauty, like I mentioned, humility and gratefulness for the world, and his notes about also the Christian wedding and this giving oneself in service of a higher principle in the form of a candle which unites the couple. I think all of these things, I believe, were not so much present in his previous work, but act kind of as signposts of where he may hopefully be heading. I think also having watched, I don't know if you guys watched his podcast conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, which was very intense and kind of emotional, which was, I didn't expect that at all. But you can kind of see him struggling with himself. And I think you kind of see that in the book, especially the last two chapters or the last two rules, which are kind of connected. I think you can kind of see him maybe even debating or struggling with his own map of meaning. And he's definitely reached, I think, a limit with this book. So I'm intrigued to hear what you guys thought.
Yeah, marvelous. Thanks, Thomas. Would anyone like to give their take next?
Well, I'll tell you, I watched that video as well, that podcast, and it moved me to tears, just as he was moved to tears several times. And I've got to say that Jordan Peterson understands what C.S. Lewis meant by Christ is the myth made fact. And what really heartened me is that if he's not yet accepted Christ, it's because he understands what it means now, the sort of cost of commitment. He said that. What would it mean if one really believed this? I mean, I'm more moved by that than a person who calls himself a Christian but doesn't think it's very important. Here is someone who understands it. You know, Lewis's famous essay on the myth became fact. He said sometimes somebody might be more fed by Christianity who didn't actually believe it, but understood it as a myth, than someone who said they believed it, but didn't really think about it. And what I see right now with Jordan Peterson is exactly what Lewis talks about in that essay. Someone who does understand its mythic meaning, but hasn't been able to grasp the historical and also the commitment yet. But he knows what it means now. And I pray it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, amen. Gerard or Matt, did you have any thoughts to add to that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with Lewis. I mean, I took two things from that interview. One was, did the narrative become flesh, right? Did the myth become fact? In fact, did the word become flesh? If you want to be Christian about it, because that's part of what it is too. But I mean, did what was reputedly to have happened to Osiris and Tammuz and the others, all of which are myths and so on, which are similar, not identical, really happened in fact? And if it did, it should matter, right? And this leads on to what I think is the second point, which is then, if that's the case, why is it that those who say they believe are so untransformed by that belief, right? I mean, I gave, sorry to be anecdotal for a moment, I gave a talk to my parish group about 18 months ago, and I began by saying, do you really believe? Right? Do you really believe in the way that you believe that your house is located in the street in which it is, that your wife is faithful, that your children are brats? Okay, do you really believe it in that same way? Would you put money on it? Right? Would you put, in fact, would you put your life on it? And that's the key thing, right? That's the shattering question. And I think that's, it's the reality and the gravity and the seriousness of that challenge, which is what is affecting Peterson.
Mhm.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Jared.
His wife's name's Tammy, right? I believe it's Tammy.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that's because it's my wife's name, so that's what it kind of sticks out in my mind. But I would say I just think we have to, really. She's quiet. She's obviously behind the scenes. We see more of his daughter than we do of his wife, but definitely her faith has definitely impacted him in a way that his suffering for one thing, but also his wife's faith and her persistency in terms of her faith, and it seems to have grounded him to a great degree. And it seems to be the thing that it confronts him more than anything else, I would say, because it's easier for a secular person like Jordan Peterson in academia and everything like that, just to get lost in not everything else. But it seems like her faith, his personal reaction, his personal interaction with his wife has definitely led him to where he's at. He wants it to be true in a way that he's definitely struggling with, but she will not let him get away from just dismissing it. As something that's just not true. I think he wants to dismiss it. I think he really, truly would just prefer not to be true, but he sees his wife day in and day out, and he knows there's something there.
That's very similar to the story of Lee Strobel. I mean, if you've read his books or seen the movie they made, again, his wife became a believer first, and he wanted to just do away with it, and he couldn't. And I wonder if any of you noticed towards the end of that interview, okay, here's Jordan Peterson, this incredibly intelligent person, so rational and whatnot. But if you listen very carefully, he basically says he moved away from the faith because he saw a lot of hypocrites when he was young in the church, right? And what I'm getting at is, sometimes it really is just that. It's a sort of emotional thing. And it's interesting, he said that and moved away from it right away. But it shows us that any of us, can fall to that. We've been hurt. We saw hypocrisy, and we want to just erase it and not be hurt again. So Jordan Peterson's a real person. He's a great intellect, but he's a real person too, that is trying to deal with his past and hypocrisy like we all are.
And he sees that his wife isn't a hypocrite. I mean, that's the big thing, is that he sees that some people are genuine and real about their faith and how it's working upon them.
It's interesting to compare it with somebody like, say, Tom Nagel from NYU, who has written that not only he doesn't think there is a God, but he doesn't want there to be one. Okay, and I can appreciate, as an ex-atheist, I can appreciate the honesty of that. I often say, when people say, don't ever describe me as a devout Catholic, because then I know I've lost the faith. The correct description is a grumpy Catholic. And I'm grumpy because I would prefer in many ways if this weren't true. It would make our lives so much easier. And I'm not particularly, or many times when I'm not really happy about it. Okay, so I'm kind of with Tom Nagel on that one. Okay, I see where he's coming from, and I can kind of appreciate. I think at least some of where Jordan Peterson's coming from as well. He sees, unlike, one of the things, I don't know what you guys think about this, but I mean, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and for me, the question of whether or not there was a God and what difference it would make to your life was a really, really serious question. It wasn't, theism or atheism. Well, atheism certainly wasn't the position you kind of drifted into, because it was so culturally unpopular that to go there sort of by drifting would really be stupid. So this was an important question. And one of the things that sort of shocked me when I became an academic was that for many of my students, this question, to use William James terms, theism or the existence of God wasn't really a live question for them. I mean, it had really no more significance than arguing about who won the 240 at Kempton Park, last year. And I mean, it's just one of these kind of bizarre questions, toss it around for a little while, but it had almost no existential significance. And you can see for Peterson, of course, okay, and for Tom Nagel and others, it's hugely personally and existentially significant, and it should be.
Definitely. And what then impressed you or distressed you, whichever, about that conversation in particular then, Jared?
Well, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of emotion and displaying emotion, so I found that emotionally distressing. Okay, I would have preferred not to have seen that. I'm sorry, I don't mean to disrespect the person and so on, but there are certain things that you try to keep to yourself. You can cry if you're a man, you can cry when your father dies. That's pretty much about it, right? And so on. After that, no, I'm sorry, but yeah. So So I've already, in a sense, said what I thought was really important, because these are the two questions that seem to me that structure the whole conversation. One, did the word really become flesh? In fact, I've just been reading again. I don't know if any of you guys know the book by Pinchas Lepide, who's Jewish, on what's he called it, the resurrection of Jesus, the Jewish perspective, where he argues that the evidence actually suggests that Jesus actually did rise from the dead, but he's not the Messiah, right? Which is interesting. So here's somebody who is everything, if you like, invested in coming to a conclusion that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and nonetheless believes that it is the case that he did, right? And so even that doesn't decide the question for him, right? But nonetheless, for somebody like Peterson, I would suggest partly, not wholly, but partly because of his background, coming from generally from a Christian background, it has a huge significance. And if you say yes to this question, here's the horrible thing: you're going to have to live with it. You're going to have to live up to it, and you're going to have to be convicted every day of your failure, right? Okay, and that's a really tough thing. I mean, by nature, I'm both a skeptic and a cynic, right? And therefore, you can imagine how hard it is for me to believe. It really would make my whole life a whole lot easier. And I think Jordan is kind of on that. I'm not attributing any wrong motives to him. I'm just saying he does. I'm actually paying him a compliment. I'm saying he realizes the significance of this question, and therefore that if he says yes to it, it's going to have huge existential consequences for him.
That's why C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity, it's so easy to be a pantheist, because then when the sun is shining and you feel good, it's nice to have someone to thank. But when you want to do something really mean and nasty, it's good to know that the universe really doesn't care.
So, nice. Yeah, well, I sometimes, when atheists say that believers believe because it's kind of wishful thinking. Right. I say, well, maybe that's possible, certainly possible. But on my way of thinking about it, unfortunately, it comes with judgment, and the judgment can be affirmative or negative. So there are consequences. You, on the other hand, I might accuse of wishful thinking, because for you, you don't think there's a judgment, and therefore you can do whatever the hell you please. Okay, now which one of us is going to be convicted of wishful thinking?
Yeah, thanks for that, Gerard. I want to go in a direction kind of linked to that, actually. So I want to direct this one towards you for starters, Matt. So Dr. Richard Beck, who I've spoken with, he talks about the importance of Christ freeing us from the slavery of death itself. And like Peterson, he investigates evolution, how things have played out historically. He shows that many of our modern secularist religions, if we might call them that, are actually born out of the fear of death itself. And he gets that idea from Becker, I think. And I think this approach is actually helpful in focusing on the importance of the word becoming flesh. And I think, as you've suggested, this might be more useful to start with than sin, and how he frees us from these kind of death cults and hero projects every bit as much as he frees us from sin and death itself. So I want to ask, how would you place the resurrection and Christ's saving work into the kind of cultural conversation today?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Big question. I would say that we're living probably far more in this postmodern world that we're living in today is much closer to what it was like in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, where people didn't have so much framework of sin and judgment as they did in the Reformation, when Martin Luther came along and redefined everything. I'm not and used Paul as a means of having faith, justification by faith, to free us from sin and guilt. And I don't necessarily think it was that way so much in the 1st century, and I think we're far more like the 1st century than Luther was. So one of the things I often talk about is the idea that how do we witness to a society that no longer feels guilty? And it seems like the church has been playing that chord, that melody since basically Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So we have this idea of basically being the source of judgment, reminding people of the judgment they're under by God, and then people will choose Jesus as their salvation, the means of their salvation every time. And that basically becomes the means for saving faith. So God's going to judge us. We're guilty. Therefore, we need a savior, and Jesus is the means of salvation. Well, we did that so much that people basically just stopped believing in sin. And when they stopped believing in sin, they gave it up. You have Nietzsche and everything like that. Basically, there is no right, there is no wrong. We live in an amoral world. And therefore, we just run away from the notion of guilt, of sin. And therefore, we have no more problem. Except the deeply connected issue is that when you run from the idea of no sin, then you have the idea of that there's no right either. If there's no wrong, then there's no right. If there's basically there's no slavery, then there's no freedom. There's no opposite, basically. And so what we found ourselves in is this cultural malaise in this postmodern world of basically that there is nothing right to run towards. There is no good. There is no ultimate satisfaction for our souls in terms of a good and higher thing. And I think that in terms of the word becoming flesh, I think it's interesting that your tradition, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, particularly, has this idea of theosis, which deeply influenced another thinker, Protestant thinker, Jonathan Wesley, and the idea of acting or being moral. So, Luther's contribution was to divorce sin and, divorce the idea of, I shouldn't say divorce it. Yeah, basically that belief, it matters more than action or behavior. That basically, if you believe in Jesus, then that's going to be the thing that gets you that's going to make you saved. Whereas John Wesley really put that back into the mix in terms of the Protestant tradition, is that we really need to act accordingly. And I find it interesting that Jordan Peterson that's where he's at. When asked about the question, do you believe in God? Well, he says, I act as if God exists. That's, to me, is key. I think that's something that's a transition, a change in the dialogue or discussion that we've been having. And I think that's one reason he's had a great effect on people who have been lost in the world of, do I believe, do I not believe? Scientifically, do I cognitively, is this the right amount of belief? Well, they've rejected in terms of scientific terms. And Jordan Peterson has said, boy, there's really something really just adequate, really something foundational about acting as if there's a God. And I think that people recognize that as belief and somehow powerful. And that's why he's come at kind of the halfway house, bringing people back to a perspective. I think that Protestantism in its inception with Luther and the like has kind of steered us away from and led us to this basically situation where people just don't believe in God at all, as if it doesn't matter, he doesn't exist. So we're totally getting away from, we're not quite getting away from fact, like C.S. Lewis said, it's the myth made fact, but in terms of getting more towards myth and finding myth acceptable, I mean, that's basically Protestantism has completely eradicated the myth. You can't have the myth. It's all fact. And if it's just fact, well, Jordan Peterson is inviting us back to the archetypal, Carl Jung, the meta-narrative, coming back to that place. Does that make sense? I mean, you asked me a big question, so I'm trying to bring all these pieces together and bring a little history in. I hope I didn't go around it too much, but
no, that's very interesting. Would anyone like to take that up?
Yeah, Matt, it's funny that you should say that, because I think it was Jonathan as well in the video where he was talking about that in some Christian circles, there was some initial, maybe still is, some hesitancy about Jordan Peterson in the sense that they felt like he might be psychologizing Christianity, obviously, and might also pulling Christians into a more sort of quasi-secular Jungian type of Christianity and away from let's say the fullness of the faith. But that's probably true maybe for some people, because I know an anecdotal example. One of my friends, he grew up in a very fundamentalist, non-denominational church, and because of Jordan Peterson, he actually moved away from that. But he didn't become an atheist or an agnostic, but he was more like he kind of moved away from that type of faith because he felt like he's talking about something else that I don't have in this church that I'm currently in. And now he's kind of exploring and reading more and into Orthodoxy as well, and Catholicism, and also, just thinkers like Thomas Merton and things like that. So he's kind of, I guess, recentering himself through Jordan Peterson. And I guess you were going to ask me this later as well, but I might as well deal with it now. I feel like Jordan is acting as this bridge, but I don't feel like his map of meaning is something that people will kind of stay on. I feel like it's a natural kind of progression towards the Christian faith for most people, including, you know, myself. There might be some people who fall off, but I feel like the net win there is much bigger. And even you mentioned how Jordan's Christianity is a type of Jungian type of Christianity, but even I think Carl Jung himself in his latter years moved away from the sort of psychologizing into the Christian faith. But I haven't read all of his latter works. I can't speak for sure about that.
You know, it's interesting when I look at the medical ordeal that poor Jordan Peterson has been through. I say to myself, this may be the first time that the devil has attacked a non-believer for leading too many people to the faith. I mean, you know, I don't want to say everything is spiritual warfare here, but when you look at what Peterson's been through, it looks like he got somebody really, really mad. Now, I know, thinking of what Matt and Tom said here, is that, you know, as a good evangelical, when I started watching Jordan Peterson's videos about the Old Testament, you know, of course, my first, instinct is, oh, he's not treating it as historical. Let's shut this off. And I'm like, well, no, wait a minute. I mean, he's not there. Okay. He doesn't understand. But what he says about what it means is actually very, very true, and certainly strengthened my faith and strengthened my insight into Genesis. And so, again, you know, what you're saying, Thomas, it's kind of a middle place where people can first have their eyes open to what this means and let the Spirit take them the full way. But there is a lot of truth in his lectures on Genesis. It's amazing.
Could I pick up on a point that, no, beg your pardon, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, pick up on a point that Thomas was making about whether or not people will stay with Peterson, if you like, in his position. But I think he serves an incredibly useful function. I was at a session he gave in Dublin about 2 years ago, and I was intrigued because there were about 8,000 people there listening to a discussion between himself and Sam Harris, and I can't remember who the other person was, talking about things that, generally speaking, you only hear in the university. And these were, first of all, a large proportion of young men between the age of about 20 and 30, significantly. And also they were riveted. And when the question was put to them after about an hour and a half, whether or not they wanted the conversation on the stage to continue, or whether they'd prefer a question and answer session, the acclamation was for the conversation to continue. Now, I had to leave the session a little bit early before I finished. And when I was walking back, because it was a wonderful summer's night, along the River Liffey to get my train home, there were some people who'd been at the session as well, and obviously were leaving. They were conversing. And these were, I don't mean to sound elitist by this, but these were ordinary people. And they were discussing issues that we probably, if we come from an academic background, whether we realize it or not, we think, you know, these really are for us. They're not for the kind of plebs. And I was astonished. So my point is, to come back to Thomas, is that he has opened up, whether you like it or not, for very, very many people, questions that they have been, as it were, inoculated against by the rest of the culture. And he has done it in a way where, as we're on a kind of C.S. Lewis kick, he has found a way to slip past watchful dragons. Because if you start talking religious language, all the flags go up and the barriers go up and you can't get through, right? But he's not talking about them specifically in those terms, at least not to start with. And therefore, before people know it, their minds are engaged by these questions, which are real and genuine, which everybody is concerned with. And therefore, who knows what happens after that? Each person, if you like, takes responsibility for their own positions on these, but at least he's allowed those questions to be, the seeds of those questions to be planted, okay? And then we shall see what the effect will be. And I think if for no other reason, I mean, thank God for Jordan Peterson.
Oh, man. And Lou, I want to take it back to you and ask you about some of the history behind Tolkien-Lewis and this idea of the myth becoming fact. And what does your work say in response to inquirers like Peterson? And why is it so important that the myth became fact, as they hinted at in the video and everything else?
It is so important. And a lot of people know the story that Lewis didn't directly become a Christian from atheism to Christianity. He became a theist first. And he was there 1.5 years, depends who you believe in the biographies now, but at least a year, he was a theist, unable to move forward to Christianity. And one of the things that was holding him back was his love of The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer, and this idea of the corn god or the corn king, and this idea that throughout the mythologies of the ancient world, you have characters like Osiris and Tammuz and Mithras and Adonis and Balder, who seem to be telling a similar story of a dying and rising god. And Lewis just bought into the pre-converted Lewis bought into this idea that Jesus was just the Hebrew version of this same corn king or corn god myth. And then when he took that famous walk along, Magdalen College, along Addison's Walk, those beautiful trees there, and Tolkien suggested to him, the reason that Jesus sounds so much like a myth is that he's the myth that was made fact, or the myth that became true. And that just revolutionized Lewis. He thought, why is it whenever I read the story in Norse or Greek or Babylonian mythology, I'm so moved and I think it's wonderful, and then I read it in the Bible and I'm bored. It's like, wait a minute. And to me, this is important. And I think maybe Jordan Peterson is heading there, is this beautiful apologetic that drew Lewis to Christ answers a question that I think a lot of us struggle with, whether we know it or not. And that's the simple question: are you telling me that before Christ came into the world, that God ignored 99% of humanity and only cared about the Jews? Well, he only spoke directly to the Jews, what we call special revelation, but he didn't ignore the Gentiles. He spoke to them through creation, through their conscience, through their reason, and through what Lewis called the good dreams of the pagans. So that when Christ came into the world, he not only was the Jewish Messiah, he also brings to fulfillment all the highest mythic yearnings of the pagan people. And so they all meet in Christ. And I think that's a message that certainly this modern generation wants to hear, that again, Jesus is not just this narrow Jewish Messiah. He's the savior of the world that answers all our yearnings, whether we're a mythic loving pagan or we're a Marvel Cinematic Universe loving modernist. We want to know that Christ fulfills all of those yearnings and desires and needs.
Beautiful. Thanks, Lou. Would anyone like to take that one up?
I think that says it all.
Yeah. What can we add to that? So moving on then, Thomas, I want to ask you about, so you're an historian. I want to ask you, what role do the methods of history or the philosophy of history helped us to play in this approach to the resurrection then?
Right. Yeah, that was a dense question as well. I have to admit, I wrote down some notes here so I wouldn't go on an insane ramble. So I'd say history, if honestly done and rightly ordered in light of the resurrection, helps us to continually deepen our understanding of our own story, and consequently helps us to regenerate and recenter our society. And so to relate that question, your question, back to Jordan's book, I think it's the same type of mechanism that he talks about in figuring out your own story, and especially those events in your past that you don't want to look at or that you don't yet want to understand. And enhancing our knowledge of our own story can help us to figure out where we are, what we are aiming for, and why we're aiming for that, what Jordan talks about in his book. I think it's the very mechanism that roots us, but it's also careful to cut off the dead wood of the past so that new branches may grow. I think John Lucas, in regards to historiography, said this beautifully. He said, our historical tradition is like a grand cathedral, which is both a reminder of our fallen state. I think C.S. Lewis famously stated that human history is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy. But that cathedral is also kind of an ark harboring hope, beauty, and transcendence in Christ. And so this building is never quite complete, just like our historianship is never complete, historiography is never complete, and always in need of careful renovation as we continue to increase our understanding of ourselves through our shared history. So I think historianship aimed at or centered in Christ positively transforms our understanding of ourselves in the past, the present, and the future.
This is a long one for me. So where do we hit the limits then of what we call science now, which I really suppose in many cases is philosophical naturalism? And what is the real central difference between the likes of Jordan and his kind of scientific peers, if we might call it, like Sam Harris, for example?
Yeah, I just I just sent you a copy of a paper I've just written on what I've called the atheist bluff, which the electronic version of which I've just given to Mark, so he can make it available to whoever wants it and so on. But it's very interesting. There's something very odd and kind of sadly pathetic about philosophers whose idea of science is firmly rooted in the 19th century. It hasn't moved, right? And they are more scientists than the scientists themselves. And what they think of as science is a sort of dogmatic materialism, which is resolutely and implacably opposed to being open to anything else. And of course, the position is, I'm not calling into question the propriety, if you like, of ruling out certain kinds of questions when you're doing science. I think it's not only correct, I think it's entirely proper, right? So for example, we don't think that objects fall to the ground because they are madly in love with the center of the earth. It doesn't make sense. Although, to be frank, by the way, the notion of gravity doesn't make a whole lot more sense either. It's descriptive, right? Nobody's ever been able to explain it, but leave that to one side. So we can leave that to one side. So generally speaking, I mean, modern science begins in the 17th century when teleological explanations are kicked out as being methodologically inappropriate. And I think that's actually entirely correct. But the problem is that for many scientists, for many philosophers and theologians, not so much for scientists themselves, who generally don't interest themselves in these questions, what began as a methodological move has become a metaphysical move. So it's one thing to methodologically rule out these questions. It's another thing dogmatically to say that they're metaphysically impossible or they don't count or they shouldn't be considered. And that's the problem we have. And so, I mean, it's very easy to demonstrate when you take somebody like Harris, who has written a small little book on free will, denying that there is any such thing. It's like shooting fish in a barrel to point out that, well, for example, Sam, who wrote your book? and what did you think you were doing when you wrote it? And why do you think that anybody who reads it will actually believe it's true, since on your conception of things, there isn't any such thing as truth, right? It's so incoherent as to be laughable. And no matter how many times this is pointed out, they go on and on. In fact, they're filled with a sort of evangelical fervor to persuade us of the falsity of the idea that we have meaning and significance in our life and there's free will. And I think, well, that's great, guys, but where does all this fervor come from? Who exactly are you trying to convert? Because if what you say is true, there aren't any selves to convert to this. There aren't any minds to grasp the truth, of which there isn't any, according to your position. It's quite bizarre, right? So the easy reach, if you like, for science says, by the way, anybody who ever uses the phrase, the science, doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Okay, there is no the science. The science is the materialist equivalence of Holy Scripture says, okay? It's meant to be a conversation stopper, right? And of course, there is no the science. Science is a method, okay? It's not results, okay? And indeed, as we know, as anybody who knows what the scientific method is, all results are provisional, however well established they might be. And indeed, the more well established they might be, the greater the chances that they'll be overturned. My son, in fact, my eldest son was telling me this morning in a Zoom call that they apparently that in some, this just made a news, so I'm just giving it to you, this is coming to you fourth or fifth hand. Some group of people doing experiments on subatomic particles have discovered a discrepancy between the weight of some muons and what they should have expected. It's out by a factor of something like, so they had this theoretical conception, but when they actually ran the experiments, the results came in with a discrepancy of something like 25 to 30%. And this raises a significant question. I mean, for those of you who know the philosophy of science, you'll know that at the end of the 19th century, basically physicists thought that all the serious questions had been answered, and there were a few small problems with black body radiation, and that was pretty much it. And after that, we'll wrap it up, publish the book, and that'll be it. We'll just learn it. And of course, we know what happened. Okay, the whole of science changed radically in the 20th century, and we have no guarantee that it won't change radically, and so on. I mean, I doubt if any physicist could be happy with what seemed to be like the bizarre and random multiplication of subatomic particles, okay, it seems to get more and more incoherent. Where's the grand story here? And I'm not poking fun at physicists here, because any serious study at the limits, because theology takes you to the limit in one area and philosophy takes you to the limits in other areas, and science takes you to the limit in other areas. And when you get towards those limits, the questions get really, really difficult, and it gets harder and harder to find answers. So yeah, I'm just charmed as I was, because I had to read Harris's book and it really put me off. I also had to read a book by Rosenberg called The Atheist's Guide to Reality, which ruined 3 months of my life, which I'll never get back. Okay, and so my publication of this little paper is my revenge. It's very unchristian of me to do this, but I had a lot of fun making fun of people like Harris and so on. Sorry,
Yeah.
Mark, that was a bit of
Yeah, thank you, Gerard. Would anyone like to jump in on that one?
Gerard, I have a question for you. You were talking about teleology being kicked out basically as an explanation in the 1700s. Do you know about Fermat's principle?
Fermat's last theorem.
Yeah, so basically the idea of optics, basically how light travels, basically. Do you believe that brings the theology, teleological explanations back into physics, or is that basically you can look at physics in a teleological way, and it's just been the way we've shifted our minds to not think of it in those ways?
I'm not sure if I know the source you're referring to. Okay. But let me sort of.
I read Ted Chiang's. So Ted Chiang did the movie. He wrote the short story behind the movie Arrival. I don't know if you know science fiction, if you read science fiction at all, and it's called
Too much.
This is Your Life, I think is the name of the book, the short story. But he talks about in terms of, he brings he's obviously a scientific person. He thinks in terms of science. He's obviously a science fiction writer, but he brought in the idea of Fermat's principle and the idea of teleology in science, in physics, and just the way we think about things in a different way. That it seems to be that if we switch the way we think about it, we could find teleological explanations in our physics if we just simply reversed it. So basically, we're looking at the same information, the same exact phenomenon, but one could look at it teleologically and one could look at non-teleological.
Yeah, well, as a general sort of intellectual approach, the answer is yes, of course. And we take for example Newton. Who's the founder of sort of classical physics. Newton was much more interested in theological questions than he was in physics, and bizarrely so in many ways, as we would think. But so he didn't see any sort of problem in pursuing these. The question is, historically, it's not. Well, first of all, there are people who think that science wasn't done at all until the end of the Dark Ages. Well, I, for a start, reject the whole idea of the Dark Ages, because that's one of those pejorative terms. We live in the light. We're illuminated. We're the enlightened ones, and the peasants who lived before us didn't know anything. Okay, so there were no Dark Ages. But it's certainly true that that physical science, as we now think of it, kind of coexisted in a kind of complicated melange of inquiry and was not really separated. Just as, for example, economics existed before the 18th century, but it really was a sort of branch of moral theory. And it wasn't until it was distinguished from it that it began to sort of make progress. Now, it also made a lot of regress, so that's another story. Okay, so I would think that from the point that modern physics, which begins with the methodological expulsion of teleology, has made great progress. And I think it would be probably inappropriate to reintroduce teleological considerations there, provided that you understand that, the mistake that physicists make, the mistake that Hawking's made, for example, is to think, and indeed Rosenberg in this last book that I had to read, is that the physics gives us all the answers. And I'm going, well, there's one answer, there's one thing it doesn't tell us, and that is why it is that we believe that physics gives us all the answers. Right? That's not a physical proposition. You can't get that from your physics. Where does that come from? And obviously that's a metaphysical presupposition, right? So as always, they find themselves doing philosophy, but because they're ignorant or they despise philosophy, they end up doing very bad philosophy, and very ignorant philosophy. Just like Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, spent, I think, like 20 pages dismissing about 3,500 years of theological reflection. Ooh, that was easy. Okay, fine. Okay, let's get rid of that. So to answer your question briefly, it's certainly possible, and who knows what the future will hold, whether or not we can get kind of empirical research and teleology back together again in some way. But I'm not really worried about their separation, provided that the people who do the empirical research aren't making imperialistic claims about the extent of their activities.
Mm-hmm.
Gerard, I wanted to ask you something from the Catholic Church that I find very interesting. As I understand it, okay, if you have a daughter and she starts acting strange, and you take her to the priest and say, I think she's possessed, do an exorcism. The priest will not immediately do an exorcism. He will investigate, he will rule out any sort of biological, biochemical, emotional, and only if he's ruled out any natural explanation will he perform an exorcism. I don't know if I'm getting that right. Is that, I think that's an interesting possible model for what we're talking about here.
Well, yes, again, I can't, I remember you're talking to a grumpy Catholic here, so I don't know whether this is true or not, but I suspect, given the methodology, I mean, if you look, for example, at the process of declaring somebody to be a saint, right? So it requires an investigation into their life and their habits and their practices and so on and so forth. And if something is claimed to be a miracle and so on, it requires an investigation and so on. So it's not like we have sort of buttons saying, oh, goody, let's see, you look like Apostle Saint, let's just press the button on you, right? So I mean, yeah, clearly it would seem to be methodologically appropriate if, for example, you had somebody who was behaving oddly, that you would, as it were, move from the ground up, okay, to rule out all of those causes beforehand. I mean, is it some kind of hormonal disturbance? You know, are the vitamins upset? Who knows what the story is? And you go through all of these, and only it would seem when you've ruled when you've ruled out all of those possibilities, should you then move to a consideration. It's like, I mean, I often say about saints that when it comes to miracles, to refer to another Lewis book, I'm a general believer and a particular skeptic. Right? Which I think is the appropriate thing. I mean, my attitude is, if somebody says it's a miracle, I go, oh, great, terrific. Well, I mean, I'm glad you believe that, but hey, I'm not called upon to believe it. Maybe it is. I don't know, right? It could well be, you know. But I happen to think that God primarily works through secondary causes, and so I'm not in the business of multiplying miracles beyond necessity, you know. So I think that would be the appropriate approach. Yeah. Yeah.
I think in light of the resurrection, it strikes me that C.S. Lewis is right, unless it was the Christian story was later made up. That's one other option. But you know that famous trilemma? You might be able to help me out, Lou. The idea that he was either mad or, whereas you can't sort of have him as this domesticated Jesus. Does that make sense?
Liar, lunatic, or Lord.
And you know, and the wonderful thing about his liar, lunatic, Lord is, it really works even if you deny the absolute authority of Scripture, because, you know, I'm sorry, even if you deny it, you know, as a inspired book, when you read the Gospel of Luke, it is clearly based on eyewitness accounts, and nobody rose up and said, Jesus never said that. The Pharisees never said, Jesus never said that. The Pharisees said, Jesus said that, and that's why he's a blasphemer and needs to be put to death. Or other people said, yes, that's why he said it, and that's why we need to cart him away and put him in an insane asylum. So, in other words, you don't have to believe in the Bible as the word of God to look at the Gospels and say, we don't have the option of Jesus is just a good rabbi, a good prophet, and nothing more, right? Either he was who he said he was, or he was insane, right? Because there are people who think they're Jesus or God, or he was a liar and a deceiver. And we need to face the fact that if in fact Jesus was not the Son of God, then he was the worst blasphemer of all time. And the Pharisees were absolutely right to condemn him and turn him over to the Romans, right? I mean, imagine Jesus coming in a Muslim country. They would put him to death for blasphemy. And they would be right to do so if he was not, in fact, the Son of God. So, you know, we're forced to look at the evidence, and we can't just domesticate Jesus, right? He's not a tame lion, right? And we need to deal with it. And either, what does it Lewis say? Either, you know, spit him as in a devil, throw him off into an insane asylum, or fall at our feet and worship him. But let's not go on with this patronizing nonsense about him being a good man and nothing more, right? He never gave us that option. He never intended to. Amazing. Just imagine that. That was first spoken over the radio during the broadcast talks, 1940, 1941, while London's being bombed from the air. And what you said, Gerard, about hearing those people discussing issues, I imagine a bunch of sailors sitting in a bar while they're playing the broadcast talks and actually having discussions about morality and ethics. Maybe we're coming back to that, which is a wonderful idea.
Yeah, I know.
It's interesting. Like, even if you were to accept that Jesus was like a Jared Leto figure, like a fake running a cult or whatever, then his disciples, they betrayed him, and then they must have also figured out, well, he didn't resurrect, so he was just one of those guys, and well, that's embarrassing. But no, they go out into the world, and then with incredible fervor, and then they get stoned and berated, and they all die horrible deaths, and for something that they knew that they knew was fake. Why would they do that? Like, I have some of my friends will tell me that, and then I say that to them, and they're like, well, yeah, I guess that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, they at least they truly did believe that he did resurrect. You can maybe say, like, oh, well, maybe that's not true, but there's no argument. It seems to me that they did believe that he resurrected, and that it was real.
They didn't believe readily. If you read the scriptures, even after he had appeared to them,
Matthew 28.
So it's not like they went, yippee, yeah, here he is, and let's go out and do it. Even after the resurrection and the resurrection appearances, it took a long time for them to grasp the significance of what had actually happened. And this is the point, by the way, again, I referred to that book by Pincus Lapide on the resurrection and so on, again, as written by a Jew, and he points out that whatever stories might be told, one that is just makes no sense whatsoever is to think that they sat around, had a committee meeting, and made up this yarn that they would. And he says, no, their history, their lives, the sacrifices they made, the things they did, all testify not to the fact that Jesus was God. He might not have been, right? But that they certainly believed it. Yeah. I mean, giving up your life for something doesn't make that thing to be true, but it certainly testifies to your belief. Yeah. That it's true, okay? And nobody could have behaved as the apostles did. By the way, not the sharpest tools in the block, you have to admit, right? I mean, leaving aside a certain number 12 who disappeared and shall be nameless and so on, okay? But amazingly, I mean, these hillbillies, because that's what they were, these Galileans speaking with a country accent from the American South or from Kerry, which is the place in Ireland where we think people speak funny.
Well, I mean,
I hope nobody from Kerry watches this, by the way. I mean, I'm in big trouble now. I mean, these hillbillies, these roughnecks, okay? And Galilee was like an outpost territory. I mean, the Judeans, people who lived in Judea, didn't really think much of. They spoke funny, and they were kind of not sure if they're quite fully on board with all this Jewish stuff. Yeah, so these people infused with, as we would think of it as Christians, with the Holy Spirit. And so on. But even if you didn't believe in the Holy Spirit, you would have to, as it were, from a secular point of view, look at these people and say, I don't know if what they're saying is true, but they certainly believe it.
And I think especially Paul's story wouldn't make any sense either, because he had absolutely nothing to gain from his it's not really conversion, right? But it's that he already was in, let's say, a position of power, what we would call nowadays, and he was doing quite a good job at it, and then he just did the complete opposite for something that he didn't believe to be true, or that doesn't make any sense. It's just an incredible story.
People focus often on James, the brother of Jesus, too. What changed him? He wasn't a believer.
That's right.
And I love it. N.T. Wright has added to all the other stuff we've said. What happened to the body? All that. He also says, certain things happened in the early church that couldn't have happened without something like the resurrection. First of all, they stopped the Sabbath and started worshiping on Sunday. What possible event could make the Jews move to Sunday? They also stopped the animal sacrifices. And now this is before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. What could possibly make them? And then they started speaking of Jesus as Lord. Again, the changes that happened in the early church simply could not have happened without an event like the resurrection that would change things so radically for these Jews who were the first Christians.
Yeah. One interesting thing about we're thinking, because I'm interested in, I'm planning a book actually on the very idea of resurrection, and from a kind of both a philosophical and a theological perspective. But the one very interesting thing about scripture is that if you compare the accounts, let's say, of the crucifixion, of the trial crucifixion of Jesus, there's basically a convergence. The accounts largely converge, right? There are discrepancies, as it were, explicable and not understandable discrepancies, but there is a sort of a large convergence. If you look at the accounts, however, of the resurrection, not the event, because nobody was a witness to the event, but of the appearances afterwards and the empty tomb and so on and so forth, what you get is very different. It's not convergence. You, as it were, get the kind of thing that you would get if there was a sort of street accident and people who were busy doing other things suddenly turned around, and one person would say the person was speeding and others was going slowly, coming from this direction. There were, I mean, you get these you get these various perspectives which don't fit neatly together, right? And for me, I find that more convincing than if they'd all been kind of lined up. It's exactly what you would expect when an event that is unprecedented, because it is unprecedented. Nobody else in the history of the world has ever been resurrected, right? We've had resuscitations, which is a very different thing, but no resurrection, right? And so we get this kind of kaleidoscopic views on it, and it's, I would think, practically impossible to hold them all together in a single view if you simply look at them from the outside. Okay.
You know, we've had a number of apologetics books come out in America, and they focus, the way they kind of focus, like you're saying, is, all right, what would a objective judge think if this evidence was brought to him by all these witnesses, right? And if all the witnesses were exactly the same, the judge would immediately say this is collusion and throw it out. Or if the witnesses were wildly off, they would also throw it out. But what we get is what a good judge would expect. Different, it's the accident, like you said, they've all seen the same accident, but from different points of view and different perspectives. And what you get is eyewitness testimony that converges together, but doesn't repeat each other. And you know, the Bible claims to be eyewitness accounts. All the different gospels are eyewitness accounts. And it would probably be judged right by an impartial judge, even today.
Thanks for that, Lou. And Thomas, I want to move on to something that we've spoken about, René Girard and his approach to history and the focus on mimesis and all these things. What is it that you think is so interesting about Girard as an historian?
Right, yeah, I think that kind of ties in what I was saying before about sort of Christian historianship. I think he used the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ to completely reframe our understanding of many of the pre-Christian myths and of the origins of religion in general as well, through his mimetic theory, as you said, and the scapegoat mechanism, and also pointing out that in that way the uniqueness and the sort of continuing and sort of ever increasing influence of the resurrection on history up to this very day. I think he's particularly helpful in understanding also our present moment, and in this insistence on the fact that Christianity is not so much dissipating, but that we're rather living in this type of super Christian society, or the super Christian moment, especially in regards to our at times pathological concern for victims and social justice that we're seeing now play out apart from the church. What I've been wrestling with, though, a little bit is how to reconcile, you know, the Girardian sort of negative view of these pre-Christian, the classical pre-Christian myths, and the more positive view that Jordan seems to have for, you know, he mentions the founding myth of Marduk and Tiamat a lot, and he says something in his book as well, that you need to embody the spirit of Marduk, that we all are still embodying it, or that we still should embody that. So I wonder, when I was reading it, I was really wondering whether Jordan was being too agreeable in regards to these pre-Christian myths, because I don't know if it's necessarily a good idea to embody the spirits of these pagan gods, so to say. But I know that Lou wrote a book, or multiple books, right, about on the topic of these pre-Christian myths, and you kind of talked about it before, about how Christ kind of fulfills this dying and resurrection, and so I would like to know kind of what you think about this contrast between the negative Girardian view and the more positive. How can we reconcile those two views?
And I mean, first thing, it's good to remember that, all these people, we talk about Tammuz and Osiris, Adonis, Bacchus, etc. They're all ultimately seasonal myths about the seasonal cycle. It's an understanding of life, death, and rebirth, right? For as far as we know, at the Eleusinian Mysteries, that was the oldest cult in the ancient Greek world, that they would put a ripe ear of wheat, or Gerard and Mark would probably still say a ripe ear of corn, right? Which really confuses Americans when we speak of the corn king. They really mean the wheat king, the way we speak, right? They didn't have any corn in the ancient world until they got it from over here. But anyway, there is an understanding of life, death, and rebirth. And in what I think it's in From Achilles to Christ, I suggest, I can't prove this, but when it's John chapter 12, just before the upper room discourse, they are at a celebration of the Passover, and there's a group of Greeks there, right? And the Greeks go to Philip, probably because he has a Greek name, and they say, we would like to see Jesus. And he goes and says, Jesus, these Greeks would like to see you. And Jesus responds by saying, the hour has come in which the Son of Man will be glorified. And then he says, except a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it will remain a single seed. But if it dies, it will bear much fruit. And I really believe that Jesus there is building a cultural bridge and speaking directly to these Greeks. Now, we don't know who these Greeks are, but I'm theorizing they're from the Eleusinian Mysteries. They would be the ones who would be interested in Passover rituals. Because if you search the Old Testament, you never see that metaphor of the seed that dies and is reborn. You might get the sower and the seed, but that's a different idea. This is a very, very Greek metaphor. The only other place we see it in the Bible is in 1 Corinthians 15. That's Paul's great chapter on the resurrection body, but he's speaking to Corinth, a Greek city, and using Greek metaphors. Otherwise, we don't see it. So I think that Jesus is saying to them, you have been worshiping the seed that dies and is reborn, usually through very bloody stories. Now I'm telling you, I am that seed. But what you've worshiped and yearned for at the Eleusinian Mysteries, I am that seed. So these very, very violent myths of Tiamat and stuff like that, and the fighting of chaos. Mark, you started this whole thing with chaos versus order. Those old stories of crushing Tiamat, it's a story of order coming out of chaos, right? Because really, the only verse in the Bible that's really creation ex nihilo is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, Hebrews says we need faith to believe that God created that which is seen out of that which is unseen, right? But the rest of the creation account, once God, whatever you want to call it, the Big Bang, once God has gone poof, the rest of Genesis 1 is a story of God making order out of chaos. That's the rest of it. And that's probably why poor Milton could not understand creation ex nihilo. That's one of the weaknesses from a Christian point of view of Paradise Lost. You just can't understand it. But the rest of it, it's in Ovid, it's in Hesiod. All of this is this idea of making order out of chaos. So again, even though their stories are in many ways demonic, they still understand that one of the things that God, what the Greeks would call logos, and they would pick up on, by the way, make sure you see the first episode of The Chosen, because it plays with the idea of Christ as the logos, and it's unbelievably powerful. Anyway, so what we're saying is that, yes, these stories are demonic, and even Milton understood that the Greeks and Romans and Norse are a little bit closer to the truth than the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Philistines and the Phoenicians, whose stories are much more demonic. That's why Milton gives all of his demons the names of their gods, but he doesn't give them the name of the Greco-Roman and Norse gods. The idea is that this is even farther away from the truth, but still there is a basic, deep understanding of the need to get order out of chaos, and even of life coming out of this horrible death. That kind of answers that. One thing we might bring up, and I don't know if you want to go this way, Mark, or not, but we've talked about so many aspects of Jordan Peterson and why he is so essential. But there's one other aspect of Jordan Peterson that I think is maybe the most important thing in a world that's gone insane. And that is that he has the courage to speak of masculinity and femininity as real, essential things. Yeah. Jordan Peterson may not be a believer, but he has seen the Paralandra and Malacandra. He has looked upon Venus and Mars, like in Lewis's book Paralandra, and he has understood that there are essential differences, that these differences are good. I think his understanding of Jungian animus and anima is a little bit closer to Christianity than Jung's. Maybe it's not fully there, but I think it's actually closer to Christianity. And that's how all of this started, right? He refused to use the what do you call those
pronouns?
Pronouns for transgender, which took a lot of courage. Remember, he lives in Canada, not America. It's much worse in Canada. But again, he's trying to restore an understanding of just essentialism, right? Anybody that wants to say, I mean, basically, even though he has some links with a person like Sartre, he is not an existentialist. He clearly believes that we are not simply born and make up our essence as we go along. He clearly believes that we are born with an essence, not only masculinity or femininity, but an essence that, that part of our meaning in life is determining our essence and moving into that. I mean, that is really revolutionary in the modern age in which he's writing and speaking.
It's kind of amusing that one should be considered revolutionary for saying there are males and females. It seems bizarre. By the way, Mark, that book that appears over your right shoulder, you shouldn't have that sort of nonsense showing. Okay.
Hidden agenda, and it's right next to my book. Look at that. There we go.
That's the kind of thing that's going to get you into trouble, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the first time I actually came to know of Jordan Peterson. It was in that context, and so on. And so, full marks for standing up for that. But we're under a lot of pressure, and so on. That's why I wrote that book. It's because it's. I mean, I make the point. I'm a political libertarian, so I don't really care from a political point of view what people do. It's not my business, and so on. As a social conservative, I do. But then I believe the tool at my disposal is persuasive, is persuasion and not coercion, right? And that's the story. So I do care deeply about it. But the point is that we are now getting to a stage. So my objection isn't to, some man thinking he's a woman and behaving accordingly. It's my and others being forced by law to attest to something that is just patently false, and to the institutions of our states being transmogrified in the most bizarre fashion. It's quite strange. And I mean, as I think, I can't remember who it was, the guy who wrote for Spike, Brendan O'Neill, said, when a society can't tell the difference between male and female, it's in serious trouble. Okay, and so it is. Yeah. So well done. Kudos to Jordan for doing that, and for everything that sprang from that. Yeah. But there's an essential grasp in reality there, which is the modern world is in many ways a phantasmagoria. It's quite bizarre. I mean, we have all these phantoms and ghosts going around that we are told are genuinely real, and the things that we know are solid and real, we are told are simply ghostly. And I don't believe that story.
As an academic, one of the things that Lewis did for me and so many other academics is to let us know that real reason and real reality are actually on the side of Christianity and not the enemy. I mean, when I read the first letter in Screwtape Letters, it just blew my mind away. And he's so exactly right, but it's literally like a veil is torn away. All of us, they're Christians, huddling, just leave us alone, just let us be emotional and feeling and we won't push it. But it's like, no, it's the enemy that wants, the real enemy, the devil, that doesn't want us focusing on reason, right? Yeah, give them shadowy stuff and all that. And that was just so freeing to understand. So that, and I love this, okay, because today we have that horrible idea of being woke. Well, for C.S. Lewis, becoming a Christian was waking up, because it was waking up to the true nature of reality. So I want us to wake up, not be woke, which is sort of wonderful.
Well, it was Kant who said that reading David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers, to which I remarked cynically that he promptly went back to sleep again. So it is ironic that those who are most in the grip, if you like, it seems to me, of fantasies, make the claim to be awake, when for me they're living in a nightmare of their own creation, which they want us to inhabit. I solidly refuse to do so. Okay. Thank you. No.
Thanks for that, Jared. I want to ask you next, Jared, about Timothy Keller speaks about trusting in the God who brings life out of death. And I think this meets with what Jordan talks about and is an antidote to resentment and to ultimate despair, obviously. And this game that Peterson talks about, the iterated game, is fulfilled, I would suggest, in Jesus, who plays the ultimate cosmic iterated game and puts love and truth in their proper place, I would suggest. And taking what Peterson says to the fullest measure by embodying that cosmic weight of responsibility, as he talks about physically in this his life, death, and resurrection, and in his ascension, offering us heaven, which meets what seems to meet what Jordan's talking about when he speaks about being in the zone in that conversation with Pajot. Does that make sense? And is this a better way of coming at the concept of heaven and indeed the new heavens and the new earth than the more disembodied conception of what we've been hearing for too long?
Well, I mean, for one, I think the whole notion of a disembodied, I mean, sorry, let me start again. When you go to Mass on a Sunday, one of the things you say in the Creed is not, I believe in the immortality of the soul. You say, I believe in the resurrection of the body, right? And therefore, this idea, which is, I said, if you took a poll of many Christians, believers, and so on, and asked them what they thought heaven was, they would give you an account that was essentially Platonic. The idea is that our ultimate destiny is to become a sort of low-grade angel and sort of lurk around on the fringes of heaven and that sort of thing. And I'm going, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. First of all, human beings are not angels. We don't become angels. Jesus says we become like angels. That's quite a different thing. Okay, I'm like a millionaire in some respects, but I don't have a lot of money, right? So there's a big difference between being one and being like one. So, I mean, for me, one of the things that attracted, when I was an atheist and in college, one of the things that attracted me, I took a course, don't quite know how I managed to do this, on Thomas Aquinas. And I was struck, even though I thought the guy was, insane, I thought the guy, I thought he was resolutely kind of robustly realistic. There was a certain solidity about what he was doing. And when we were talking, you mentioned, Lou, you mentioned Paul's Corinthians 1:15. And when Aquinas is commenting on this, he wrote a commentary. He says, anima mea non est ego. My soul is not me. Right? This is Aquinas. I'm not talking about some freak. So you're not your soul. Human beings are essentially embodied creatures. We are not destined to become disembodied, even if there is an intermediate state in which that, in some way to be explained, has to be. Nonetheless, our ultimate destiny is not. And indeed, we don't go to heaven. If you read scripture, you will see that heaven comes to us, right? And so when you see it in a larger perspective, the opening narrative of the scriptures is the fracturing of the relationship between heaven and earth, between God and man. The ultimate restoration of all things is the bringing together of heaven and earth, a new heaven and a new earth, which are new in one sense, but a continuous in another respect. And right smack in the middle, as the pivotal point of human history, is Jesus Christ, God and man, human and divine. Not, as somebody once said, half God and half man, right? But both God and man. And there you have, if you like, the exemplar of what the beginning should have been and was before it was fractured, and what our ultimate destiny is to be. So this idea of going to heaven, which is quite bizarre, but it also means that it has a backwards effect on our life. So many Christians tend to think of life as some kind of prolonged examination, which is set by kind of an arbitrary God, like a pop quiz. You don't know what's going to be on it, okay? And so if you pass the test and you're lucky, you go to heaven, okay? But if you don't pass the test, you don't go to heaven. And I'm going, really? That doesn't make any sense to me at all, right? I mean, and it doesn't not only make any sense to me, but it doesn't make any sense when you read scriptures, right? Wow. It says you're asked quite a different thing. It's not a matter of passing a test. It's a matter of becoming what God made you to be in the first place and wants you to be, and freely to accept a relationship to him, which is one of love. Now, this is one of these words, but I told you I wasn't an emotional guy. So when I hear people talking about love, I get very queasy and uneasy. But once we understand that love is not liking, I have to say, by the way, when I was thinking about becoming a Christian, and when I suddenly realized that when loving somebody didn't mean you had to like them, I was immensely relieved. Okay? Because love is a matter of the will. It's desiring the other's good, and you can do that even if you don't like the swine, right? you may and probably will come to like them if you do love them, but love comes first, and love is a matter of the will. It's not a matter of the emotions. So that relationship of love, freely given, and it's interesting, by the way, if you're into literature like Lewis is, there are so many tales in literature of the elixir of love, elixir del amore, right? Where somebody desires the love, say, of a beautiful woman, and she's not reciprocating it. So he gets this magic potion and that he gives to her, right? And then she falls in love with him. But of course, the result is always disastrous, because what you've got there is a simulacrum of love. The other person isn't responding freely to you in love. The other person is simply being controlled by a drug or by magic. And that's not what you want, right? And therefore, what you thought you desired and what you angled to desire and what you get is just this bitter fruit, okay, which you cannot eat. And therefore, the Christian story, I mean, I can remember being with a graduate student once. We were correcting exam papers and, of course, bored out of our minds. And she started asking me, because she knew I was a Christian, she started asking me these questions. And I started answering, you know, Christianity is a matter of a relationship between yourself and Jesus Christ and God ultimately, and so on. And we talked for a long time, but what horrified me was she thought that this was my own ingenious explanations and so on. And I was going, no, I would like to take credit for this, okay, but unfortunately, this is just a story, right? But she goes, that's not what I heard when I was growing up. And I said, well, I'm sorry for that, but we also heard a lot of rubbish when you're growing up. Yeah. Okay, so as the chess player Emmanuel Lasker once said, at the age of 40, he said, I spent most of my life unlearning things. So Christians, to come back to your question, Mark, okay, Christian, we need to get rid, I was asked a question once for a short piece, did I believe in life after death? And I said, yes, and I believe in life before death as well. And that is a typical kind of smart answer you get from a philosopher. But I just meant that both are real. One isn't simply a propedeutic, one isn't simply a test, okay? Our life has begun. In fact, the next life is right here. Okay, and it will continue, we hope, okay, if we love God and he accepts us, which he does, okay. But so there are some very strange conceptions going around, and this idea of going to heaven is one that really needs to be shot down, okay, torched, put on a bonfire and burned. I want to see that destroyed.
In America, part of the problem is one of my favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life, which makes people believe it's an angels movie. I bet, you know, right. It was, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 years ago when American evangelicals finally realized that we're part of a sacred narrative. But at first, we didn't get the whole thing. We spoke of creation, fall, and redemption, and we stopped it there. But over the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, finally, those in the know realize it's creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And some are actually adding glorification, which is kind of theosis. But it took a while to understand it's not just creation, fall, redemption, it's restoration. Oh, before I forget, Gerard, I just want you to know that in Narnia, a man can cry and hug and it's not thought killable. You might remember there's Narnia.
You'd be glad to know that I'm not particularly fond of those sections of the Narnia book.
Aren't you Irish? Aren't you Irish? You're making.
I'm a real man. We have emotions.
See, I thought the Irish had the emotions, and it's the English that never cry.
No. That's the libel and so on.
It's libel.
Libel and the slander. And so on. We're reserved. The average Irish farmer would buy and sell the average Englishman, lock, stock, and barrel.
Well, see, as a Greek, I've always believed that what Ireland is a Mediterranean island that got lost and ended up getting attached to the British Isles. Because you see, just think about it, right? Whenever we talk about Greeks, Jews, Italians, Arabs, we always use the word ethnic, right? But nobody ever calls a British person or a German or Dutch or Scandinavians, nobody calls them ethnic. But I think of the Irish as ethnic, right? There's something different there. And at least a lot of Americans think of it that way too. So I don't know.
We call the Germans other things. I didn't say they were bad things. I don't know why you're all laughing.
I think what you were talking about, Gerard, I find it interesting. Obviously, we're talking about a little bit about John here and his theology of logos and theosis and things like that. And to me, First John is an absolute primer on the idea of embodied love. Basically, the idea that how do you know? This is the big question: is how do you know who the children of God are? The question is, how do you know anyone's child? You know, you see that Maury Povich show. I don't know if you guys have Maury Povich over in the UK or over in Europe, but Maury Povich does this thing. He's a daytime talk show host, and he has this thing: is it the father or not? And so you bring these people on stage, and you don't know if they have the kid, if the kid was theirs or not, and he would do a paternity test and do the big reveal at the very end. Guy says, "It's not my kid. It's not my kid. It's not my kid," and he'll say whether they were father or not. In essence, First John is like that, basically asking us whether or not we can know if God is our daddy. And how do we know if God is our daddy? And basically, John is at a loss to say, well, how do you know a disembodied spirit? The only way we can know is to look at, when we know to be his son, is you look at the physicality of Jesus and love Jesus, love physically. So to have this idea of a disembodied spirit and to have any type of meaning, there is no such thing as meaning without expression, meaning without physical expression, some kind of physical form. So this whole idea of John getting back to the fact of saying and that's why he was opposed to the Gnostics who said that Jesus did not come in the flesh, but the idea is Jesus loved fleshly. This is how we know what love is. Love, Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to also lay down our lives for our brothers. So that's how we know, basically, this idea, the evidence that says this is the DNA. Basically, he says at one point, he says, how do we know the sons of God, the seed of God? He says sperma octu, basically the idea of having the seed of God in us. Well, that's in essence the old form of DNA. Well, how do you know the DNA of God? Is that you have the same physical form, the same physical expression, and that's a love in a physical form. So
could I just pick up on the one? I mean, I agree with all of that. Could I pick up on one other point, which is this whole thing about theosis and so on? There is a part of the Mass which is generally said sotto voce by the priest, which most people, if they hear it all, don't pay any attention to, which for me is the most riveting part of the Mass. It's between it's between the handling of the bread and the handling of the wine. And when the priest says, when he's pouring the water into the wine, says, "As you humbled yourself to share in our humanity, may we come to share in your divinity."
mm-hmm.
Now, that should rivet you to the ground. That is either false, outrageously false, blasphemous, sacrilegious,
Mm-hmm.
or thrilling.
Yeah.
Again, which is it to be? To come back to the Jordan Peterson thing, is if it's true, it's incredible. So again, one of the things that factors into this thinking I'm doing about, if you like, resurrection and life after death, after a physical death, is how to reconcile the essential embodiment of the human being, the restoration of all things, the coming down, if you like, of the New Jerusalem, okay, and the new heaven and the new earth, and the idea that human beings are to be divinized as much as is possible. Obviously, we can't become God. There's only one God. The job is already taken. Okay, so there's no vacancies there, right? But nonetheless, our nature, while remaining the same, that has to remain the same. It has to be a human nature. We don't become a different type of being. Nonetheless, there is we remain in one sense the same, and then we move, if you like, into a different realm and in a different mode of being. And the only exemplar we have for that are the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Give us some idea. That's the only model we have to work on.
Well, Athanasius said God became man so that man might become God.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's a very,
It was perfectly Orthodox Christianity. I mean, both East and West. Okay, yeah. The modes of expression might be different, but the reality expressed, I think, is the same.
Yeah. I find it interesting, just studying Mark's gospel and stuff like that. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus basically is confronted with the three questions. Basically, they try to trip him up and try to basically expose him as a fraud. And one of the things he says in Mark, one of the questions is asked of him. Let me see this real quick, and I think it has to deal with this idea of this connectivity that basically, in essence, we are connecting humanity to divinity is found. Hold on one second. Don't mean to take up your time too much, but here. But when they ask him, oh, come on. I'm sorry.
I'm disappointed you can't quote from memory.
Yeah, it's in, but he says the two questions, basically, the final question, which is the greatest commandment. The guy comes to him and asks him the greatest commandment. And he says that there's two greatest commandments. And the one first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, soul, and strength. We know that one very well. And he says the second is like it, and it is to love your neighbor as yourself. And but he quotes in Mark's gospel, he quotes the Shema, which is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." He says there's one Lord. And the very next question, or at least the very next issue that Jesus raises in verse 35, he says basically, Jesus asked them, how can the Christ be the son of David? And he quotes from Psalms 110, and it says, "The Lord said to my Lord." There's two Lords. But we just heard in the Shema in Mark's gospel, Mark 12, he says there's only one Lord. And yet he demarcates two commandments. One is to love the Lord with all your heart, mind, and the other is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. In essence, he's saying there's two aspects of this one commandment. There's two aspects of this one Lord. There are two Lords, in essence, in this one Lord. And it's very interesting how he's bringing those two things together.
Yes, well, there are intimations in the Old Testament or in the Jewish scriptures of if you like, elements of community within the Godhead.
Mm-hmm.
They're not developed, they're intimated, and so on. And you find them in the Psalms. You can find it, of course, at the very beginning when God uses the plural pronoun, we, and so on. So yeah, all of that's the case. But what's interesting about the quotation you make of the you must love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind and your whole strength, and your neighbor as yourself. I always find that interesting. People say you must love your neighbor. Well, that's true, unfortunate but true. It says you must love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say you must love your neighbor despite loving yourself or in place of loving yourself.
Right.
It says you must love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Loving yourself is not a problem. Liking yourself might be a problem. Most of us don't like ourselves very much, right? But loving yourself shouldn't be a problem. We should, in other words, loving as desiring what is truly and perfective and fulfilling of our nature, right? And we desire that for ourselves. And so we should desire it for everyone else as well. Because in the ordinary run of things, in the non-miraculous order of things, if there is such an area thing, we are the hands of God. We are the means by which God operates in this world. We are the means by which God's love is shown to other people. I mean, they will know you are my followers by the love you show each other. And you go, that's why Jordan Peterson's question is, why, if what Christians say is true, why is it so untransformative? Why doesn't it seem as if we actually love other people?
Mm-hmm.
To which there are, of course, answers, and we know what the answers are, right? It has to do with sin, right? And the nature of it, and it's so on. But yeah, so I'm not sure if he even from the Jungian, I mean, you would think from a Jungian perspective, which is the one where he comes from and so on, where there are always these dark sides. So it's not all sweetness and light. There's the animus and the anima and so on and so forth. You would think that answer was sort of suggest itself to him. And the one thing that you need to avoid, of course, and the one danger that Christianity has to avoid is lapsing into some kind of Zoroastrian dualism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the principles of light and dark, good and evil, if you like, are co-constitutive of reality and in a sort of an eternal kind of struggle. Yeah. Anyway.
Lewis called that a manly religion, but it's not true, because if you have an equal good and bad God, then how do you know which one's the good God and which is the bad God? That's his tertium quid idea.
That's right. Yeah.
Everything.
Whoever wins.
This is great.
We know how it works. It's whoever wins, right? The good guy always wins.
That's right. Yeah.
It seems to be in the Christian tradition that you cannot love God apart from loving others. Basically, we could, in other religions, you can love God and not love others, but in Christianity and Judaism, that love is specifically expressed towards humanity, towards other beings like yourself, and that's the way that God is loved.
One of the most to me, there are many, again, people who read the scriptures generally, but the New Testament in particular, aren't terrified at some things that they read, haven't been reading it properly. Yeah. One of the most terrifying is in Matthew. I'm not sure where it is, Matthew 28, which is when I can't even remember the circumstances now, so I'm certainly not quoting from memory. When Jesus said, they're asking who will be saved, and what's the question? He said, on the last day, I will say to those, you know, you fed me when I was hungry, you gave me drink when I was thirsty, you clothed me when I was naked. And they say, oi, I don't remember doing that. I mean, I'd like to take credit for it, but honestly, I don't remember doing that. How did that happen? And he goes, whenever you did this to the least of my little ones, you did it to me. And this is the horrifying part. And then he turns to the others and he says, depart from me. And they say, but Lord, why? And he says, you never gave me to drink. You never clothed me. You never fed me. You never came to visit me in prison. I said, when do we refuse to do that?
Yeah.
Because if we'd seen you, of course we would have been first in line. And he said, no, because you did not do this to the least of my little ones. And that is terrifying. And for me, this is one of the images of the cross, because the cross gives you two dimensions. It gives you a vertical and a horizontal dimension. The vertical dimension is a relationship to God, and the horizontal is a relationship to the love of other people. And the two make up, if you like, our destiny. We love God through loving other people, and we love God by loving other people. And there is no way to separate those without destroying the cross. Even when you don't know God, even when God is absent from your life, okay, and you feel this kind of void that the mystics talk about in the long dark, or as Douglas Adams would talk about, the long dark tea time of the soul, okay, the long dark night of the soul, even when there's a sort of void there and you feel sort of despair like Mother Teresa did for much of her life, okay, nonetheless, you must trust in God and you must love God in the only way that you can, as it were, directly, because he seems to be absent from your life otherwise, by loving other people.
C.S. Lewis gave us that nice promise. If you learn to love your neighbor as yourself, then you can learn to love yourself as your neighbor.
That's a good point.
And really, you know, if I had to choose just one of all Lewis's insights that opened my eyes more than anything, and most of you will recognize this, he says, people keep telling me you have to love the sinner and hate the sin, but that's impossible to do. And then Lewis said, it's not impossible to do. We do it every single day to ourselves. We continue to love ourselves while we hate the sin. And the reason we hate the sin is because it's preventing us from being the person we know we should be. Absolutely. And if we can take that and bring it to our neighbor, because you're right, love our neighbor as ourselves doesn't always mean saying, oh, it's okay. I mean, it says, no, what you're doing is wrong. It's hurting yourself, right? I mean, it's not love to let a drug addict go on in their drug addiction. Love is to say, stop. Right, that's loving your neighbor as yourself.
The key scripture passage for that, of course, is the controversial one where the woman taken in adultery.
Right. Yeah.
This is often portrayed as if Jesus is kind of easy, happy, clappy, hippie, everything, let it all hang out. But you're not paying attention again to the story, because when the would-be rock throwers have departed, okay, and Jesus is left alone with the woman, and he finishes writing in the sand, and he says, where are your accusers? And she said, Lord, there are none here. And he said, neither do I accuse thee. But he said, go, and then the important thing, and sin no more. It doesn't say it wasn't a problem. It was a bit of patriarchy, and all of the rest of the kind of crap that you might get today. He just says, he looks at her, she looks at him, and I often see them sort of, I kind of visualize them. She's looking, going, how did that happen? I was like that close to getting stoned, and suddenly there's only me here and this guy writing in the sand. Who is this guy? And he says, go and sin no more. And that is it. Of course, you're absolutely right. We do love ourselves. Okay. Well, we don't. When I was remarking jocosely a little earlier about not liking ourselves, one of the reasons is because we know what we do. We know the gap between what we are, okay, who, unless they are engaged in massive self-deception, doesn't realize the effort it takes to look in the mirror in the morning and take yourself seriously, okay, and not people talk about the imposter syndrome, okay, in academia, the idea that somebody will find you out. Well, there's a spiritual equivalent, which is, I always think one of these days they're going to find out I'm a hypocrite, okay, and I say, well, actually, there are lots of sins to my account, but hypocrisy isn't one of them. It's not that I don't believe what I say that I believe. It's just that I don't always do what I say I believe, and that's the difference. And so that's the problem. Okay, lots of sins. Yeah, hypocrisy ain't one of them, right? But I might get around to that eventually too.
Well, you mentioned the sheep and the goats, and Lewis pointed out something we always miss. He says to the goats, "Depart from me, O ye wicked, into the lake of fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels."
Yeah.
That suggests that hell was never intended to house human beings. And so Lewis's point in The Great Divorce is that the people that are cast into hell are, in a sense, not human beings. They're the remains of human beings. And I really think, whether he understands that or not, Jordan Peterson is also understanding that in the advice he gives us. The advice he gives us is making us more into who we are. And when we don't do that, we slip into a sort of non-entity where we're really not, we are the remains of human beings. You know, the greasy stain on the window that you can look at it or look right through it. And that's pretty scary, but it also gives a psychological dimension to the gospel. That is, Christ makes us into who we are. And beyond that, theosis. Whereas sin literally dehumanizes us till there's nothing left. And that's sobering, isn't it?
It's chilling.
Yeah.
Gosh, I want to ask you next, actually, Gerard, if we might, kind of apprehensively now, based on what we've said before. So maybe it's because I've spent too much time with the Brits or something in London.
Oh,
but...
that was a shocking thing. Nobody's ever going to forgive you for that, right? You traitor.
But I actually find Jordan's emotional responses very moving and interesting.
Oh, Mark, you've gone soft in your old age. Come on now. Come on now. Toughen up.
I understand many do as well. And I'd love to see if you'd care to speak to some of the distinctions between some of the dominant worldviews we have operating today and how they view emotion, and how we might place emotions in their proper place rather than our dominant emotivism, as they call it, or whether Jordan's Jungian approach helps, or how might we get back to the biblical tradition of the lament and away from maybe more Stoic, I don't want to oversimplify these philosophies, but or Stoic approach or a Buddhist approach or things like that?
Yeah. Well, the story is told of the Roman general whose son, killed in battle, was brought in on his funeral bier. And he said something like, well, everybody dies. and you realize, of course, there's something completely wrong with that reaction. Yes, it is true that everybody dies. But this is not the time or the place for the expression of this kind of detachment. So emotions have we are bodily beings, I said that earlier, and our emotions are a function of our embodiment and are perfectly appropriate. It is, in other words, to be a properly developed human being, even in the humanistic perspective, is to have the right emotions in the right circumstances. Okay, that may not mean not necessarily expressing them. Okay, that's a different story. But and so on. So part of my in my previous book called After Me Too, I was making the point that men generally don't have the luxury of expressing their emotions because somebody has to stay in charge in a crisis. Okay, we can't all collapse into tears, right? And therefore, there's a time for doing it and the time for not. And generally speaking, men are enculturated to do that. But the fact that we don't necessarily express them doesn't mean that we don't feel them. If you didn't feel them, there would be something radically wrong with you, right? And that's why the response of the Roman general was entirely inappropriate. But what we see today, of course, is a strange phenomenon, which is that feelings are now the ultimate, they have an ontological significance. They are the ultimate determinant of reality. What you feel yourself to be is what you are. Now going, really? How does that work? I mean, this is where it gets very philosophical, it gets very Wittgensteinian. How do you know what your feeling is? Suppose I'm a man and I feel that I'm a woman. What does that actually mean? How do I know what it's like to feel like a woman? I have no standard by which to go. All I can do is to operate secondhand on stereotypes, which are purely external. There's no self-validating internal feeling which can indicate what it is that I really am. It's quite bizarre. Okay, I mean, the classic expression of this, of course, for philosophers is Thomas Nagel's essay, "What's it like to be a bat?" Right? And his point is, we don't know, and we can never know what it's like to be a bat. So let me give you the example. Bats, as we know, navigate by sonar, right? So clearly they emit noises and they hear the responses. Now, when we think of this, we would tend to think of sort of screens and little blips coming up, right? But a bat, whatever it's doing, cannot be doing that. The bat's world is constituted orally in the same way that our world is constituted visually. We don't have to compute the light rays that come into our brain and put them on a screen and figure it out. We simply see the world and move around in it, right? So we can understand, in that sense, what it's like to be a bat, right? By analogy with our own understanding of what it's like to be a human being visually. But we can never experience what it's like to be a bat. It's just not possible. We're not that kind of creature. Similarly, so if your feelings are telling you something, so when it comes to reality, if your feelings are, your internal feelings, however strong they may be, are telling you that you are something which you manifestly are not, you've got a problem. And I would suggest respectfully, it's not a physical problem, it's a psychological problem. Go sort it out.
Clean your room.
T.K. Chesterton said in Orthodoxy, he said, the problem with Nietzsche's will to power is if everything you will is true, then your will is actually meaningless.
Absolutely.
I mean, he just, as only Chesterton can do. Wow. I'm still trying to figure out what it would mean to be a German speaker, where you don't even know what your sentence means, so you get to the verb at the very end of the sentence. I mean, that's strange enough to try to figure out how your mind works.
And remember, the sentence goes over to the next page.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, a real German sentence. My first head of department said to me, he used to polish up these anecdotes. He said, Mr. Casey, he said, remember that when you're reading a French book, you should never read the footnotes. They're simply there for decoration. But when you read a book in German, you should read only the footnotes.
That's right, because that's the book. Especially German theologians, unfortunately.
Oh God, yeah.
Matt, I want to take it to you now, if we may. I want to ask you about, so Tim Keller, like other small O Orthodox Christian scholars, points to the fact that the resurrection offers a new type of power that's not reliant on death or the threat of death, as per many critical theories and postmodernism, like the older gods of the world, even like we mentioned before. Can you speak to that and its our contrast with postmodernism or these critical theories?
I think that the resurrection offers a pretty profound way of changing the world. I think it's pretty clear that it changed the world within the first 3-4 centuries and obviously radically transformed Rome. That it basically did something with suffering that nobody else could, which basically made suffering meaningful, and also gave an ability to forgive, which otherwise could not be forgiven. I'm trying to wrap my mind around this real quick because these are thoughts I've had in the past. But if this world is all that there is, and I think that's pretty much what everybody believes it is, this world is all there is, then I have no resource from which to draw in order to suffer or also to forgive. But if I know that I have a down payment coming, that this world is simply an extension of some other reality that's going to make itself known in the future, then I have a resource I can draw from, and I can utilize that resource in a way that's pretty profound today. So even if the resurrection isn't true, Christians live in a world and a dimension which is more powerful than those people that walk around thinking that this world is all there is. They think of a world that's limitless in their and the possibility endless. So I think it's pretty profound that, yeah, Tim Keller is absolutely right that the resurrection offers a life now in abundance that nobody who doesn't have experienced that can truly know. And I think that's been the heart of basically why Christianity was able to transform the world in the way that it has. Because we operate with believing that you can wrong me and I can live with that wrong, because that wrong will simply be righted by the world that's to come. I don't have to take it out on you, Because if it's simply this world is all there is, and you've done a wrong to me, then the only thing I can do is do wrong to you, because there is no other place to do it. You know, there is no place to do it. And basically Christianity opened it up the boundaries to say that you don't have to do it because it will be righted in the future. All things are working together for the good. And that with that down payment, we are able to pay the debts that we have today.
Amen.
Thanks
I
for
think,
that,
I think that's sorry, Mark.
So I just want to say, just before you get into that, Thomas, Gerard has to go, so I want to thank him for his time, and we can continue our conversation if you're all up for that.
Very good.
Thank
Nice
you.
talking to you, gentlemen. Okay,
to
it's
meet
been a
you.
pleasure.
Thank you, Gerard.
Yeah,
God bless you.
Thank you.
Good night.
I didn't know if Jared left. No, yeah. Let me see. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. Okay. No, I think that's what on what Matt said. I think that really also shows how scary the whole critical race theory and critical theory in general is, because they borrow a lot of the religious framework from Christianity, but then there is no sense of forgiveness there. There's none. Like, you are either, the oppressor or the oppressed, and based on that, like, you have to repent your entire life, but you'll still be, you'll never be able to be completely forgiven in any way. So the way, I have a lot of my friends, and so here in the Netherlands now, this is kind of like seeping into the culture as well, but it's not really a conversation in the way that it is in the United States, or it's not really a debate. It's kind of like going into the back door, and people are you can see things changing pretty rapidly now, and people are accepting a lot of these presuppositions, but I don't think they realize that this is such an inherent aspect of it. I don't think that that's not real. But when you tell people about it, they kind of go like, oh, okay. When you kind of like walk them through the implications, then I think people will they kind of give it a second thought. But truly, the way that it is a type of perverted Christianity, which kind of makes it powerful, but also so dangerous. And I don't think people see it as much here in Europe, at least. I don't know what it's like in the US now, but.
Well, I guess without the resurrection, what you get is liberation theology, modern social justice theory, basically Marxism with a veneer of Christianity around it, but with no hope. We're building utopia now. That's their version of heaven, is utopia built right now.
And that must mean all wrongs have to be fixed. I mean, basically, you have to take it out on your enemies. Because if you're not taking it on your enemies, then, I mean, basically, in essence, it's a power play. Either the oppressed are going to be in power, or the ones who are in power are going to be in power. And there's a constant struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeois. How do you spell it?
Bourgeoisie.
There we go. I can't even pronounce it. There you go. So, that's basically, it's always going to be a power struggle. But I think that the resurrection radically alters and fundamentally changes the way we are able to operate in this world. And you must believe it, because that's the power of it. It has to be believed in order to be appropriated. You cannot be just, some different thing. But once it's believed, it has the power to change everything.
Yep. Amen. I want to ask you, Thomas, about Jordan's emphasis on competence, which I think it seems to annoy many people, but I think it has its place in light, specifically of the resurrection. And when we first died to the world in its luster, then we can serve and love. So Joshua Mitchell, who I think is really interested in critical theory and things like that, he emphasizes this liberal competence, and I think it's really helpful for understanding Jordan. But he's a believing Christian, and he calls for the religious impulses of the new woke religion to actually be restored to their proper place in theology rather than politics. However, I'm unsure, again, if it makes sense with Jordan and his underlying presuppositions. How can he argue for putting them back in their proper place, as it were? And is that something that you'd care to speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, we've talked about this before in private as well, and I'm not entirely sure either. I think, Jordan seems to base his rules around this notion of the experience of pain and suffering, which is experienced universally. And so I think he mentions multiple times in his lectures as well that everybody who isn't kind of a masochist, or who does not wish the destruction of the world, would agree that decreasing rather than increasing, suffering would be a good thing. And I think that is really his anchor point for where he's coming from, where he's starting from. And then, he goes on to argue that through thousands of years of brutal experience, the human race has kind of managed to increase its competence of how to engage with the world in a manner that mitigates suffering and increases well-being, or kind of, what we talked about with putting ourselves within the world instead of like making the world mold around us, right? And all these rules, or these archetypal ways of being, so to say, have been captured and taught through our most time enduring stories and our ancient myths and the biblical stories and the fairy tales and even movies now and literature. So I guess, it kind of has a lot of overlap, if you like, with what Lewis's Tao. But obviously there seems to be a difference still there, in the sense that Jordan seems to be still rooted in a type of radical individualism. And I think it kind of struck me in his chapter on marriage, how much it is still focused on like two separate individuals who are kind of like striving with each other to make order, so to say. But it's still always sort of, there's always this sort of barrier, I feel like, in the way he talks about it. And he only briefly mentions that part about the Christian wedding and the candle, which according to him sort of represents, I guess, the institute of marriage, because he doesn't really go to say that is God or something like that. So there's division and this sort of individualism, and I don't know if that can really compete against let's say the wokeism that we're seeing now, which is really this type of firm group identity. And I don't know in which ways what the differences are with what Lewis kind of proposes. So I don't know if you guys would like to speak on that.
Well, when I hear people like in the martial arts or Buddhism, and they talk about the strength coming from within. Well, as Christians, we also say the strength comes from within. But when we say that, we mean the Holy Spirit indwelling us is giving us the strength. Whereas in the martial arts, it's just the force of energy. It's, chi, channeling. It's very different. It's not the Holy Spirit, but it sometimes sounds the same. Yeah. But where is the actual energy coming from? The Holy Spirit, or just the generic energy and the force or whatever in the universe? And there's a difference there.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks, Dave. Do you want to add to that, Matt? Or
trying to get I see where Jordan Peterson is, with all of his communist art on his wall of his home, where he's made his whole life focus on tyranny and basically the rise of tyrannical power. And so he's obviously, in that instance, individualism would be the guiding principle, that it always must be the individual over against the tyrannical, oppressor, group. I find it interesting, and just random thoughts that I'm thinking of. I find it always interesting that we go back to the idea of breaking apart, disunification. I think probably occurred most radically in the most Protestant of all Protestants, which is Martin Luther, where he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Basically, unless you can prove to me, unless you can change me, then I'm not going to change. You need to show me to basically. So he's the radical individual, the individual over against the unity, and I think from that point on, we see a great deal of cascading of a disintegration of unity. And obviously we have in Henry VIII, who is the first divorces his wife, and obviously divorces the Catholic Church and creates a whole Protestant, of disunity in terms of multi-fractured, of individuals. So I'm riffing here in terms of this idea and why Jordan is so focused on the individual over against the power of the collective.
Do any of you?
I think the power. I think Christianity is ultimately a collectivist idea. I think it's ultimately a collectivist idea, and I think that Protestantism runs counter Protestantism, and particularly its manifestations today run counter to that collectivity.
Do any of you know, has Jordan Peterson said anything about Ayn Rand? Because Ayn Rand, of course, was very influenced by Nietzsche. In fact, one of my friends says that Ayn Rand is Nietzsche for girls. But has he ever said, does he agree with her? Does he see the problems with her? But I can't think of anything I've heard him say. Do you know?
That's an interesting question.
Or anybody?
I don't.
He may not have commented on it, right? I can't think of one I've heard, but
me neither. No.
You would see that he has sympathy. He would be sympathetic to that point of view.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in some ways he would see something in Atlas Shrugged, but hopefully he would see the problems with it too. But it'd be interesting to put those two in dialogue right now.
Interesting,
Because,
because
as you know, a lot of conservative Christians are fooled by Ayn Rand, particularly if they're libertarians, think she's great. And it's like, no, not really.
Nope.
that's really interesting. I think he was looking on Twitter there the other day, actually, for libertarians to engage with, which kind of speaks to your point. Well, I wonder where he's going to go with that. But Gerard is a real strong libertarian, but he is a lot more complex than a lot of the libertarians that have come across online. And he seems to use it as a centered on the non-aggression principle as a base for the society. And then, as he said, he's socially conservative. So he's got all that collectivism, which is in its proper place. Whereas I guess Ayn Rand and people like that are a lot more problematic. And that ties in, I suppose, with what we're speaking about, in the sense that she was a radical atheist as well. And she had no ultimate conception for life that would make sense of communal kind of the church, obviously, if that makes sense. So I think that speaks to Joshua Mitchell's point too, where the characters that have their proper place, characteristics that have their proper place in the so-called religious realm, theological concepts and things like that, then have been transmogrified into politics, and that's where it goes haywire. And then I guess, in line with what N.T. Wright sort of seems to suggest, is that that's partly due to the church not being the church, as you said with me. But I think while that has its place, I think there is the other side. Obviously, the secularism has become so dominant and aggressive, and even the critical theory stuff, we use their terms, which is what I hate. So I loved your foreword, actually, or your blurb for Vaudy's new book, Lou, and I think his book is so important because there's so-called Christians being sucked in to see people primarily in terms of their skin color, adopting these new collectivisms, these new tribal identities, because I guess in part because the church wasn't being the church, being multi-ethnic and everything, but also because they are being aggressive and forcing us to use those terms about black and white and reifying all these concepts and everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, one of the weird things and scary things in America, at least, is that, you know, Marxism is all about, like Matt said before, bourgeoisie versus proletariat. But the modern American progressive Marxists couldn't care less about the blue collar worker who works with his hands. They couldn't care less about him. They've changed it to black versus white, gay versus straight, transgender. They're still talking about power in Marxist ways, but they no longer seem to care about the working man, which is very troubling.
Yeah, that's the success, I guess, in line with what I'm saying, of Gramsci's kind of desire to take over the institutions with a long march. So it does make sense, unfortunately. I want to ask you next, Lou, if I might. So both Keller and Jordan seem to suggest that the biblical God is not a God that we would invent or could invent. It's such an improbable story, in line with what we were saying earlier on, for the biblical God, suggesting that he doesn't fit with our hearts' wants or what we want personally or socially. And I think that speaks to the spiritual power of art and of literature, both of the Bible and more broadly. So Robert Alter describes this in relationship to literature and how it actually subverts ideology. So it can't just be reduced to merely the byproduct of a certain culture, say. And I want to ask you, Wendy Wright does it with art too, which I think is really interesting. Would you care to speak to this transcendent power of the Bible and great literature, or the Bible as literature, to subvert that ideology?
Well, one thing is that, as we said, Gerard was saying it before, right? Christianity is an incarnational religion. Of course, at the center, that means Jesus is fully God and fully man. But it also means that we are fully physical and fully spiritual, right? We are an enfleshed soul. We're not a soul trapped in a body. So Christianity is essentially incarnational. And the arts at their highest are also incarnational. I mean, in the simple sense that any great work of literature, art, music is often using a particular story, whatever, but embodying the universal in the particular. Coleridge called it the concrete universal. And I think that just in its incarnational nature, bringing together the particular and the abstract, the concrete and the universal, I think that art points towards the Word made flesh. I think that would be a good name, Matt, for Logos made flesh. You might want to use that. But this is what it is. It's incarnational.
I got it from you, Lou. I got it from you.
And maybe talk about it.
C.S. Lewis Agonistes was a fantastic book, man. It was life-changing, man. I really
Wait, is that where the title came from?
Well, no, but it was about the time I was starting a blog, and I read your book about the time I started a blog, and I was already a fan of John, and I read your book on the incarnation, and I was like, this is a bigger concept than just the Gospel of John, and it was radically transformative to me. So,
well, Matthew, do you think that one of the reasons why young people are so drawn to film is its incarnational nature? Do you think? Whether they know that or not?
I don't know. I don't know if that to be true or not. I would hope that it would be the case, because obviously it is a way of helping to explain people what it means to be incarnational. I don't necessarily think that. I think we're just drawn to stories. I think if we didn't have movies, we'd be listening to someone around the fireplace, telling stories. I think that's what we genuinely love, narrative, and I think and art. I think we just genuinely love art. So
that makes sense. And I do think, including myself, that people are drawn to Jordan Peterson because of his focus on archetypes. People love all that. The hero with 1,000 faces, Joseph Campbell, and he's at that. He's coming at it from a Jungian approach and whatnot. But I think that is one thing that attracts people. They reckon, and I was kind of alluding to this before. I mean, there are a lot of people who say that they're existentialists, that they believe existence precedes essence. But I don't think anybody really believes that. I think every human being, whatever their religion, believes that they were made with a purpose, and that part of their job is to figure out what that purpose is and live up to it, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll do terrible things to do that, like divorce their spouse so I can fulfill it. But the point is that is completely inconsistent with a Darwinian atheistic view that would say we merely exist and we make up our essence. But I don't know if anybody, even Richard Dawkins, really believes that. I think they really believe that they have, whether it comes from nature or God, they have an essence. They have to figure out what that is and fulfill their purpose, or what's the point?
Well, meaning is fundamental to who we are. I mean, the very fact is that we speak in a language, and you can't think of humanity without language. We can't think apart from language. And language is meaningful, ultimately meaningful. So we have to say that there's something about meaning which is distinctly, like bees make honey, humans make meaning. I mean, it's like what we do, and we have to find it. We have to, go after it. And basically what we have now is a story which basically says that meaning is ultimately meaningless. There is nothing there. And that basically runs counter to everything that we are. It's like bees, make honey, and now all of a sudden we have one of the bees spreading the lie that basically, honey is nothing. And they're like, well, honey's everything.
Wow. So in The Dark Knight, you get the most nihilistic of all people in any film with the Joker.
Oh, yeah.
And the Joker puts those people on the boat to the test. And what comes out of it but a sense of meaning, so that the Joker's actually wrong. That there is a sense of meaning and purpose and dignity, so that the big bad prisoner guy is the first one that's going to blow himself up to save other people. So, whatever, I guess he's lost. I don't know about the new Joker movie, whether he's lost or not, but anyway, but at least in that movie, meaning is affirmed in the end, and purpose.
Yeah. Very interesting. I want to go back to the kind of psychological element in Jordan and ask you, Thomas, about, in line with what we're talking about with Mitchell's work, how that plays out politically. Do unintegrated persons, do you think, project onto society their own flaws, and in turn, do societies do that to the world? So I thought that came across whenever I read Jordan's book, and it sort of reiterated the non-rational nature of history, in line with Girard and people like that were not primarily rational, as per the kind of myth, the Gnostic myth, we might say, of the Enlightenment, this disembodied reason looking around history, with societies projecting their ugliness onto the past and failing to wrestle with the harsh truths of history. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, short answer, I'd say yes. I mean, I think it's helpful to see nations as having a character, an individual character, and as seeing them as the nation as a body, a spiritual body, you would say. But I think what you're referring to in terms of in regards to Jordan's book is where he talks about how people who are born or whatever raised in a more conservative personality, they need to also acknowledge that a system of order can become too rigid or corrupt, and therefore it needs this sort of regenerative change. which is necessary, and then the opposite is true for people who are have a more liberal personality. Is that what you're referring to, kind of?
Yeah, pretty
Right.
much.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I think, yeah, I mean, we've gotten to the point now where we have where history has become, a sort of instrument for ideology, right? Because we have this new narrative of history, of like endless oppression, which moves towards this, what we talked about, this sort of radical liberation in the future, through revolution and through, the will of power, really. And so it's the same type of narrative that kind of accuses the past of all sin, and where we kind of assume ourselves to be morally superior to those who came before, which is like the worst thing for a historian. That's like the worst thing. Like that's like, you can't do that. That's the whole point of kind of like of our craft. And it's really the scapegoating of the past. But then I guess the way I was trying to think of this recently, it might also be in part a reaction to the fact that we also have, of course, on the opposite end, a sort of over glorification of one's own story, and which is maybe the fervently national histories of the early 20th century, the national identities. And I think we saw that as well in the US, which historian Richard Gamble, he called that the rise of the Messianic nation, which was kind of emboldened by a type of progressive Christianity. And I think what we're seeing now is kind of a reaction to that. And we saw that as well in the 60s and the 70s of the new left, but I think this is something else altogether. So yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. Lou or Matt, do you want to add to that?
Just yesterday I was teaching at my church group a screw tape letter number 5. That's when the war starts, World War II starts. And he says, the devil says, be careful, or these humans will lose themselves in a cause bigger than themselves. And normally, I think that's a good thing, as Lewis seems to suggest. But I wonder what you all feel, and you guys are a little bit younger than I am here, of more and more I hear young people of this generation say they want to lose themselves in a cause bigger than them. But I get what I would have seen that as a good thing during the Great Generation, the 30s and 40s. I wonder if there's not a danger of just wanting to lose your identity. I wonder what you feel, being closer, a little bit closer in age to these folks. Is there actually a danger? Is that becoming a bad thing to lose yourself into a bigger cause?
That's interesting. I guess that's part of the thing that Jordan talks about, that we are herd animals, as it were, that people do want to sort of lose themselves in the herd for protection, but there are dark sides to that. And I guess, again, it speaks to the difference between understanding things theologically and realizing that we have this ultimate self-worth that comes from God, and we don't have to perform for other people, whereas so much of this critical theory stuff, I think, is performative. And I don't see how you can even have a unified self under purely Darwinian kind of processes. I think the self then becomes an illusion. Now, that seems to be something that comes across in Gerard's recent book, that this transgender ideology, for example, that assumes a self, and he talks about that example of assuming that you're a woman or feel like a woman in the book. How can you have a coherent sense of a self that would feel like a woman if you've abolished the category of woman? Like, because Judith Butler, obviously, people like that don't recognize biological sex as true to reality and assume that gender is this pure social construct. And if that is the case, then the whole thing sort of falls apart, if that makes sense.
Right. I think the only inevitable reaction to this is that hierarchy, or this something that is above you, this principle that you serve, that you kind of subsume your own identity to, that becomes an inevitable thing. You can't, it's either nihilism or you search for that identity. And I think because the pendulum has swung so far now to, let's say, this expressive individualism, then the opposite also has to happen now, where you get, especially in Europe, I don't know what it's like now in the US as well, but I think we've seen some of that, where you get sort of hyper nationalism and super extreme right wing, hyper identitarian reaction, because that's especially I think for the younger, the generation Z as well. My fiance, she's a teacher, and so she interacts with a lot of these younger kids, and it's either like they go either way, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is why Jordan is also so important, because he kind of diffuses a lot of the ideology already, and hopefully can point a lot of the younger kids as well to more healthy, holistic, Christianity.
He certainly points towards a healthy kind of hierarchy. I'm
Yeah.
teaching Lord of the Rings now. There's a great moment. It's not exactly captured in the movie, but after Theoden has been freed and he's himself again, and he comes out, and one of the men sees him, and he's filled with joy, and he says, "Lord, command me." Right, and this is the right kind of hierarchy where he understands his role, and he is happy to have a restored king that he can obey. And that's a hard sell in this day and age, right? That there's a good kind of hierarchy, and I appreciate that in Jordan Peterson as well.
Have you seen the whole thing going on Twitter, like right now with the Red Skull? I don't know if you've seen it.
Marvel?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. You didn't see it. So
I didn't see it. Is it tied to the new Falcon and
Is that where the
Winter
lobster?
So
From?
sorry. What?
Is that where the lobster came from? The
Yes.
Hydra
Yes.
thing?
Okay. So what happened? What happened was that Mark. What's the critical race? What's the guy called? Kendi?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh, that's it. Okay. That's the other guy, right?
Yeah.
It's one of these the people who are pushing out the critical race theory, right? One of the main guys, and so he, I guess, is now a writer for Marvel, and he's writing the next Superman movie as well, which is another thing altogether. But he wrote the new comic, whatever, volume for Captain America, and so Red Skull obviously is the arch nemesis of Captain America, but he modeled him after a type of straw man, Jordan Peterson. So now,
my gosh!
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
So you have a weird, like a very strange straw man version of Jordan Peterson, just speaking some of his rules of life, but that's like, it's all obviously it's very skewed and weird. But now the fun thing is that Jordan completely embraced it and kind of doubled down on it. So now we have the thing what in Captain America it says Hill Hydra or something. That's what they say.
Yeah.
It's like the Nazis, and now he says Hill Lobster or something is the thing that
I never know what to make of Marvel because I'm watching Falcon and Winter Soldier, and so far the bad guys are the globalists.
They're going to flip it. It's going to flip 100%.
Are they going to flip it on us? Oh, that's a shame.
I haven't watched it, but kind of like knowing the tropes and the stories, they're like the way they do it is they set up a kind of a traditional type of story, and then they'll end up flipping the thing. It's like what they did with the new Star Wars movies as well, right? They kind of started the first one and it was like, oh, okay, and then all of a sudden it's subverted. And well, I don't know if it's going to happen, but we'll see. But probably it is. I don't know if you've watched the WandaVision.
Yeah, I did watch that. Yeah.
That I think that had some. I thought it started out pretty good, but it had some very strange implications in the end as well, with how they dealt with her grief and how So I think, anyways, I think Marvel's going into a direction now where we're going to see a lot of strange stories play out. But we'll definitely the comics. Don't touch the comics. That's for sure.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Lou, going back to your question about whether we're going to this collectivist aspect to this new culture, they're totally going collectivist. I think that basically it's just a change in the fault lines. That basically there's a hyper sense of individualism, but the individualism is being expressed sexually. I mean, that's basically that's basically whatever you can. I mean, you've got how many genders now? I mean, so it's this radical individualism. I wouldn't say radical. I would just say it's being expressed in a different way, where there's also collectivism in a different way. So it's just basically the fault lines are changing. The I wouldn't say fault lines. What do we call it? Just the lines are changing.
It's interesting also how this is playing out as a sort of perpetual revolution in even in these categories. I told Mark about this yesterday. I was on the train, and the good thing about on a train is that sometimes you'll overhear like the funniest conversations between people. And so I just happened to sit next to them, and they just they candidly started talking about all kinds of stuff. And they were two young teachers, probably my age. And I think there was a girl and a guy. The girl was a lesbian, and the guy was gay. And they mentioned this. I didn't figure this out by myself, but he just mentioned this in conversation. But they were talking about their students and how they noticed how a lot of them all of a sudden now wanted to become gender neutral. What is it, non-binary or something like that? Yeah. A lot of the guys and especially they had, I think, one or two boys in the class who now came out and said like, oh, I'm non-binary, whatever it is, right? And and the girl got really annoyed at it, and she told the guys like that he can't do that. He can't just he can't just make himself oppressed. You know, he's still white. He can't do it. And obviously this is the funny thing, because they're losing at their own game in a sense, like
Right.
oh wait, well, because now it means that he's actually more oppressed than I am, because well, so it's funny how they kind of start eating, these sort of identities start eating at each other, and it's not a stable thing, but it's so crazy to see play out. It's very scary, but it was kind of hilarious hearing that conversation. They were trying to measure themselves, like, oh, where are you on the oppression hierarchy, and how many points do you have? And then they came to the conclusion like, well, it doesn't really matter, we can't really figure it out, because in the end we're all white. So we're still oppressive, so we're always at the top, and we're also in Europe. So so it's just so it was a sketch, really. It was a sketch.
That's right. Yeah.
It's Anyway,
what do you call it? Sorry.
I was just going to say, my understanding is that in America, all these girls that are going transgender suddenly, that the vast majority of them are white girls from privilege.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it seems like, and make sure you see Jordan Peterson's incredible interview of the woman that wrote the book.
Yes, yeah.
What's going on. Did you see that? It was very, very good.
Oh, yeah.
And that girl was not a believer at all, the woman that wrote the book, but she sees what's happening, and it's kind of a group think mentality as they all come together and do it.
There's a snapshot of her book, Prager University. She did like a 5-minute little thing, a blurb on it. It was really good. So is
this Abigail Schreier?
Yeah, Schreier, yeah.
I was going to talk about that there, actually, and I think it's linked to, the way Glenn Lowry talks about social capital. I think it is social capital, and the statistics that she gives in that book seem to suggest that this is rising so exponentially in line with that, because they want that social capital. They want to call themselves a victim. You don't want to be one of the oppressors. So it makes complete sense.
Yeah. And all you have to do is say, you just call yourself something different. You can still be the same, but just call yourself by a different name.
Exactly right. You make no demands whatsoever in terms of
I'm non-binary, but I'm still married. I'm going to start saying it. I'm still married to my wife. I still got 4 kids, but I'm non-binary.
you can say that you're super straight now, right? That's the
You can't judge me just by my actions. You don't know what's going on in here.
I want to ask you, Matt, actually, about something. So I was really moved by Jordan's focus on the particulars of home and the sense of loss that he found growing up. And he mentions a kind of rootless spirit that's not focusing on particular houses, for example, but seeing them as just one of a genus. And I wanted to ask you, does this hint at our kind of modern scientific way of looking at the world? And I think Jordan seems to, alongside people like Roger Scruton, suggest that this isn't enough, and it is making us homeless. And I think you see that in the sexual realm, but in other realms too. Does that make sense?
I'm going to have you unpack that for me a little bit, Marcus. Just a little bit, and pack it a little bit more.
Yeah, so I guess in line with what you're saying there about those girls don't have self-conception of they don't have a conception that they matter. So Richard Beck talks about this. He talks about mattering versus the kind of desire to focus inordinately on the self, which is more performative, and you have to always be attending to other people. Whereas if you're a beloved child of God, then that's what could be more worthy. It's like Jordan and Jonathan, whenever they talk about the greatest story being ever told, Christ trampling down death by death, and not just being another mythology. You can't tell a better story after that. What better story is there than you being God's child, the God of the cosmos? And they don't, obviously these young secularist people don't have that, so they have to sort of see themselves. I guess that speaks to the collectivist tendency too, to give themselves a sense of worth. But I think for me, it seems to be in many ways a continuity of the old Enlightenment project, that there's not this stark contrast between modernism and postmodernism. And this seems to be something Chloe Valderay talks about in her enchantment theory, and how from Descartes and people like that on, they had a disembodied, very austere view of the cosmos if you took it seriously, and we're seeing that sort of play out in the kind of dominant social imaginary now. Does that make sense?
No. It's lots of good stuff. I'm following with you, but I'm still not tracking what you're trying to ask me. It's good stuff. I understand that postmodernism is hypermodernism. That's how I see it. It's not like a different thing. It's basically just just a devolution of modernism. It's playing out in the same terms, the same categories, but I'm still looking for what I can contribute. Keep going.
I don't really know what more to say. I think Scruton, like Jordan, is very helpful he talks about what is the Weltanschauung, this understanding of reality. Sorry?
Worldview.
Yeah, so he talks about the worldview in terms that are more personal and has a high respect for the subject, whereas a lot of these worldviews are more objectify people, and you don't have a sense of home. So I guess it's kind of a phenomenological thing that you see in Pajot and Peterson, and how consciousness sort of lays itself out, that you actually do have a home. So whenever I was a teenager, I was into the Buddhist philosopher Alan Watts, although I think he's very problematic now. But he talks about anywhere on a sphere can be the center if it's oriented a certain way. You could be sitting and look at it. It's phenomenologically that gives you a frame of reality that you can be at home with, whereas I don't think the older modernism or the new hypermodernism gives you a home. And I think that's a key contribution from someone like Scruton, who talks a lot about home and finding your place in the nation. And does that make more sense now?
A little bit. So you're basically saying while we have a framework that places us somewhere, basically a point of reference, they have no point of reference, which allows them basically that they're listless, rootless. They have no sense of meaning. And I would say that's very true, that basically that postmodernism leads to meaninglessness and this loss of self, loss of everything. It's basically Darwin called it, evolution was the acid that ate away everything, or something like that. That basically postmodernism is doing that. It's basically eating away at everything. Whereas, there is no place that is. They're trying to form new places. I mean, we're talking about that woke thing that we're talking about, the new 1619 project, the idea of Black Lives Matter. They're trying to create a different type of center, and that's being, like, for instance, being non-white. I mean, basically that'll be the new center, and that you're something special if you were oppressed by the whites, and the whites will forever be the second-class caste system. And they're just trying to flip the scales, flip the not scales, but flip the script. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful. I totally agree with you. I'm not quite sure that I can offer anything.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks for pulling it out of me. Sometimes you do need that. So yeah. Thomas or Lou, do you have anything to say on that point, or should I move on?
Well, I do remember that Chesterton, didn't he say that he realized we're like Robinson Crusoe, adrift from some great shipwreck, right? I mean, because real reality is we're made in God's image but fallen, and if we reject either one of those, we're in trouble. If we go the Darwin way and we reject that we were made in God's image, then we're just cogs in a machine. But if we reject the fall, we go the Rousseau way, then we keep thinking we can build utopia and perfect man, but of course we have to kill off the ones that are already too bad. And like when we lose that link, and so in that sense we are homeless. We're in a wreck ever since the loss of Eden, but we still have an identity. We're still imago Dei. We're still in the image of God, and it should be easy, but it's hard to hold those two together.
I just had a conversation. I think you maybe saw it on Facebook when I was talking about what is racism. I asked a friend of mine, or I asked everybody, and pointed out the fact that Robin DiAngelo in her book White Privilege basically defines racism by being white, in essence, with no irony whatsoever. That to be white is to be racist, and that is racism itself. So basically, there's no irony in that. She really truly believes that if you are white, you are racist. So a friend of mine who's a Christian, and I only know him by Facebook. I was introduced by another friend of mine, and we've known each other for quite some time. He's theologically savvy. He reads a lot, conservative to a point, but he lives in Seattle. So he's basically, you know, in the tumult of Seattle, we had quite a bit of a discussion, and we were talking about what it means to be an American, what it means to be have an American identity. What does that mean? And he seemed to not believe that we had an identity, or we could have an identity, because we were made up of so many different things. We could never be a collective. And I found that very interesting. I was just like, I can't believe it. We have the Constitution, we have our history, our story. You know, whether or not we know where we're going or not, that's another question. But the question is, we do have a past, a history, which seems to be rooted in the fact that we were a people of freedom. We have to start somewhere, not to say that everyone was a part of it to begin with, but it has to start somewhere. Story always has to start somewhere. And we're all a part of that story. And he seemed to think that, well, I think he finally just kind of, you know, he basically just backed out of it after a while. But it's very interesting. Like you said, there is this tendency, this very strong tendency, not to have any meta narrative playing anywhere, that you cannot have an identity of any kind. You cannot be part of a collective of any kind, except for the prescribed, you know, whatever that is, that basically the new politics of victimhood. So yeah,
you're either oppressor or oppressed, victim or victimizer.
Yeah.
Lou, I want to ask you something. How should we understand Jordan and evolution, and what role does the work of people like Dr. Hugh Ross or Stephen Meyer, who's got a really interesting new book out, and other scientist apologists play in moving from, say, Jordan's pragmatism to God's providential working through evolution, or maybe more properly intelligent design or something like that? Is there a fatal flaw in his pragmatism? And,
I know. I wonder. I don't know if anyone's ever really sat down with him and presented intelligent design. That would be a good thing, because, you know, everything Jordan says is always, you know, undergirded by the evolution of human consciousness, the evolution of the race. But, you know, but the funny thing is that even though he girds it in that, most of his you know, solutions at the end don't necessitate that, and still end up treating us with a kind of dignity that we wouldn't have if we were merely the product of, you know, natural selection and nothing more. So I think my guess is that Peterson just hasn't questioned that yet. He's just using it as, you know, but you know what it is? But it seems to me that he's like, okay, remember John Gray wrote Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus? And every so often you'll hear him talk about it. He said, well, I don't know if this is nature or nurture, but in other words, he's not going to stand down and say that our essential differences come from God. But the fruit of what he says is still, we are essentially different, right? But he doesn't want to fight that battle. Now, I don't know if Jordan Peterson doesn't want to fight that battle or hasn't fully thought about it. I mean, you know, the evolutionary framework is so deeply embedded in us. A good example of that is, despite the fact that the Bible makes it clear that we were all monotheists and fell away, we're still indoctrinated to believe we all started as animists. We moved up to pantheism. We moved up to polytheism, to monotheism, to science. And even though more and more archaeology is showing the opposite, actually there was early monotheism all over the place and whatnot. So I'm wondering if Jordan Peterson has even thought to question that yet. But like I said, his solutions still point to an essentialism that shouldn't be there if Darwinism is absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I was wondering so he talks about beauty, as Thomas mentioned, and that's one of the best parts of his work. And how could you have the true, the good, and the beautiful in a universal and an ultimate manner without the God of revelation? I've never been convinced by the answers that are offered, really. So the meaning has to come from outside the system, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say. And he talked about us being meaning-making animals too. So obviously there are these different processes all going on at the same time, in line with what you're saying about monotheism too, that God has revealed himself.
Just Oliver Sacks or John? Which Sacks?
Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
Oh, okay. I was thinking Oliver Sacks. It's just funny you meant that's the guy who wrote, you know, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and all that stuff. And I love those people because they think they're disproving that we have a separate consciousness, because he tells all these wonderful stories about people that get closed head injuries and lose their memory. It's like, No, all you're proving is that the Bible is right, that we are enfleshed souls, we are both mind and body. And if something happens to our brain, it affects our mind because we are enfleshed souls. But these people seem to think that their stories disprove the existence of a soul or a consciousness apart from nature. And it's like, no, you just don't understand. We are not souls trapped in bodies. We are enfleshed souls. And so these things affect each other until, in the New Jerusalem, then boom, all of the twists and turns will be undone and we'll be free. But when you have Alzheimer's, you're in a sense, your soul is sort of trapped, but only for a while. It will be undone.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think in line with what you're saying there too, Lou, Stephen Meyer, who I mentioned, he has that new book out, Return of the God Hypothesis, and he says that if you look at the astronomical evidence, cosmology, evolution, and everything, you do get the biblical picture of the order, the intelligent design, but also that we are in spiritual warfare, and there is the realm of the devil, and in evolution and everything with different parasites, you do see those things. So we don't have this idealistic conception of history past, and it's a very interesting, complex picture. And then also JP Moreland, who I had on too, who he's really good on the soul and showing how our nephesh character of the Bible is an embodied spirit, and it can't be reduced to just your brain and so on. So yeah, I think that's true. I want to ask you, Matt, about our dominant self-defining secular humanism, and does that necessarily end up, I guess we've spoken about this already, but in our postmodern kind of therapeutic mess, but especially I want to ask you about the elasticity of language and our dominant nominalism, which I guess even before, as you said about Luther, some people like Richard Weaver would go back to the Middle Ages and talk about nominalism and how that was the defining moment. Not necessarily that there is one defining moment that when it all fell apart or whatever, but do you want to speak about the abuse of language and how that's become so damaging to our sense of meaning?
Yeah, I think that I think Wittgenstein has been used for weaponized, let's just say, weaponized Wittgenstein is basically what's happening today, that basically people are using language intentionally to steer the conversation and change the fault lines, the categories by which we're thinking about the world. Obviously, gender pronouns would be a major issue, in terms of my self-declaration defines how you should be using the language, which Jordan Peterson obviously addresses. But I mean, it is interesting how, just going off of it, I think Amy Klobuchar was on the, she was being interviewed by the Senate for the consent of the Senate in order to be the new Supreme Court nomination last fall, and she said the phrase sexual preference, which has been completely acceptable by everybody up until 5 minutes ago. But when she said it, I mean, Joe Biden had used it, many people had used it weeks and months prior to that. Nobody said a boo about it. But when she said it in the context of which she is and who she is, it suddenly became an issue. Sexual preference was no longer the right word to use, and the dictionary added it to that day. The Webster's Dictionary added the fact that it was considered offensive, because you can't, because preferring something implies that it's not chosen, or it's chosen. To prefer something means that it's chosen. Well, I mean, that's whatever strange universe this in, but basically because it was the antagonism that people experience, somebody had to express that, somebody had to make it, codify that in order to define the narrative. And we also saw that it's not confined to words too, but you know what this is at all?
White power.
Circle game, right? Made you look. It's also okay. It's okay, but it's also the circle game. If I do this behind a camera or behind you, or I do it any part of my body and you look at it, I get to sock you twice in the arm because I made you look, right? Did you guys hear about this?
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So they basically, somebody got on the internet, and it's 4chan or whatever, and they basically said this was now a racist sign and it was a white supremacist sign. And well, it's made you look. It's irony. Made to look sign now becomes a racist sign. It's a joke. And now, but because the left wanted to see, I believe, racists around every corner. Now, anytime that anybody does this now, they took it very seriously. If you do this now, it's a racist sign. And somebody in Wrigley Field, a couple of years ago, Wrigley Field, did this behind a black news reporter, basically a sportscaster, and he was banned from Wrigley Field for life.
Oh my God.
I mean, and it was like he never got the memo. I mean, this is the circle game. This is what you do on television. This is what you do. But they saw a racist because they have to see a racist around every corner. And now it was infused. But the conservative movement is doing the same thing. You guys heard about Pizzagate, right?
Oh, what's that?
Pizzagate.
Yes.
So ordering pizza, this is QAnon and all this kind of stuff. Ordering pizza has been connected with people's talking about it symbolically or not. It's a euphemism for picking up kids for sex.
Oh my.
So when you order a pizza now, it's a euphemism for sex, sex with minors. So if I say, you and I were talking and I say, let's go order a pizza, now someone's now inferring that we're not actually talking about pizza any longer. We're talking about sex with minors. And that's what they did with Hillary Clinton and what they did with John Podesta when they talked about ordering pizza in John Podesta's emails in 2016 when they got released to the public. It was Pizzagate. There's lots of stuff to it, but what I'm saying is that people are using language in all sorts of ways to war with each other, to gain sympathy, feel like a victim, feel oppressed. I don't know if that answers your question. It's fascinating to me how much we're using language and trying to change it, not naturally, not just allowing it to bubble up and occur in the ways that it's occurred before, but we're actually grabbing hold of things and codifying certain things and making them what they always were. So this is now a racist sign, even though you could say that I just meant it as a circle game. And it was always a circle game. And now one day it's completely different because someone codified it. So it was codified because the narrative needed it to be codified in a certain way in order to express that thing. I don't know if that answers your question. I've gone way beyond what you were.
No, that's very interesting. Thanks, Matt. I think the big concern in line with what Gerard alluded to is at the level of legislation and things changing so rapidly, then you can be punished legally for making a mistake in this minefield. Right. That's scary to think about. Like
microaggressions and all that kind of stuff where you're like, I didn't even intend it that way. Doesn't matter your intent. Intent no longer matters.
Exactly.
Intent doesn't matter. You've lost everything because it's like, that's what speaking is. It's all about my intent. My communication, you're trying to understand my intent. And if I say that's not my intent, I've communicated nothing beyond what I intended.
Yeah.
So
and that is genuinely frightening. And then I suppose we see that exacerbated online too, with people being banned, and that's obviously going to make things worse because then we can't flesh out these issues non-violently through speech.
Right.
How are we going to resolve our differences and things like that?
I actually, today I saw in the Dutch newspaper here that there was a column by one of the journalists of the newspaper who argued that handshakes in and of themselves are an act of aggression. That because in the context of the coronavirus, it's obviously we don't do the handshakes right now because of the virus and whatnot. But he said even after we're done with the pandemic, handshakes themselves are a type of can be a biological weapon. So if you do or what we do, he even called it like the clammy Western tradition of kissing the other people on the cheeks. All of these sort of physical greetings and stuff can be an aggression in themselves, and we should all kind of adopt more like whatever the Hindu namaste or whatever he proposed, or an Islamic greeting, because they don't involve actual physical contact, or just keep doing the elbow and stuff, right? And but I think, obviously this was very much in the context of more of a scientific explanation, I guess, whatever you want to call it, or materialist explanation. But I think it does tie into the same type of presuppositions about the same thing about microaggressions and stuff, that everything, the individual is this sort of sacred thing, and this putting up a barriers between people which seems to be playing out on all levels here, and same with the handshakes. I mean, I thought it was like the most ridiculous thing I ever read, but it was a completely serious piece as well. So I'm like, okay, yeah, handshakes now, aggression as well.
That's really interesting. I actually, sorry, Matt.
No, you're the host.
I was just going to say, it brings me back to that discussion that you told me about, Thomas, where Carl Benjamin and Pajot were talking, and Benjamin came to realize the explanatory power, I think, was it the way he phrased it, of religion. And I think that speaks to Girard again, and how it has recognized, amongst other things, alongside it being God's revelation to us, even at the kind of level that Jordan's looking at it, psychological in different ways, that it's presenting this much more nuanced map of meaning that sees the different levels of reality and how societies lay them out. And the inevitability of hierarchy and things like that being obvious, but that our modern scientific understanding can't come to comprehend all of these different layers, in line with what Gerard was saying earlier, that it has its methodological power in its proper place, but then whenever it's universalized and made into a worldview, same with critical theory too. So, although I don't even think it's useful as a tool, some people think it's useful as a tool, but then obviously it's very problematic when it becomes a very low resolution picture of how reality actually lays itself out. I think that example you gave is a very interesting symbol of the scientific materialist mindset that results in this disembodied way of being together, whereas these religions, for lack of a better word, have shown a much more complex, interesting and humane, in line with what Lou talks about, and Lewis with the Tao throughout history was a lot more complex and respected, more comprehensive understanding of the human person than this thing. In line with what I was saying about the genus too, where people are so dehumanized, you're just one of a genus, but you're not seen phenomenologically and all of these different things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that inevitably it just becomes pathological because it's so like lower resolution, and you know, it's kind of it's so funny because the article in question, you know, it kind of questions like, why do we do handshakes in the first place? And it comes from the sort of scientific, it's like, well, you know, there's all the germs and stuff, so like it doesn't make any sense to do it in the first place. It's silly. It's just like, you know, it's two arms, two limbs going and then going up and down, right? That's the entire vision of like, we can get rid of it and everything will be fine, right? But it's funny how, you know, we call ourselves enlightened, but really we've just forgotten like what all these things mean. Whereas before we would know. Right, we would know that these are important things and traditions that we can't just like easily get rid of, that we should easily get rid of without thinking that there'd be consequences to it, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to add to that, but
yeah, thanks for that, Thomas. I've got one more question here actually, because I don't want to hold you guys too much longer. Is that all right? Holding you hostage here. So I'll start with Matt on this one and then we can open up. So obviously Jordan is famous for the clean your room thing. What are some of the ways that someone who's interested in Jordan, that's maybe interested in moving beyond Jordan like Thomas did, what are some of the ways that we might go beyond cleaning a room? What advice would you give people? I think Keller, for example, offers several ways. First, however, I would suggest that we must follow Christ in what Paul Miller calls the J curve, and live through death and receive the commensurate offer of new and higher life. So death to the ego, I guess, and how you do that, say in your marriages and things like that. So you sacrifice for, and with what Thomas was saying about community and communion, you sacrifice for other people pragmatically, even at the start, like Jordan says, to establish these good habits, and then that'll maybe open up a perspective for people to understand and see that higher resolution map that we are communal creatures. Would you have any advice for people?
Yeah, I think that cleaning your rooms is a great place to start out from in terms of extrapolating out from that. But basically, by action, we define our belief. And I think that, you know, thinking about this over the past, you know, decade, more than decade or so, that I think about how much we've been committed to thinking rightly or having the right set of cognitive beliefs, and how much Jordan Peterson has invited us to simply act and behave in ways which are consistent with our beliefs, or the beliefs we espouse. I just listened to a John Piper being asked a question not too long ago, and he's a staunch determinist. He is a Reformed Christian who believes that God chooses to give salvation to some and chooses to damn others. I don't know if he believes in double predestination, but basically, in essence, that it is not our will and we can do nothing to participate or bring about the salvation which we desire. And the person had written to him a letter asking, sir, I don't know if I believe, and they were in deep distress because they did not have the belief that they believed would require God to basically make them one of the chosen ones. And his response was, well, isn't that great? Because now you know that you're in desperation to find out if God, you know where it truly comes from. And I was like, just tell him to act. Tell him to act. Tell him to get up. And if he believes, act as if he believes. And I think that what is so amazing about Jordan Peterson is that his quandary with his conversation with Peugeot is I don't know what it would look like. Right. And I'm like telling Peterson, it looks exactly like that. It looks exactly like what you're talking about right now. And everybody looks at it, everybody admired it. They said, whoa, isn't he so close? Look at, he's weeping over the situation. He admires it so much. And in some ways, he is acting accordingly. I don't know if he doesn't cognitively believe it in the way that we think he might cognitively, but I always say this to people. I said, hey, what belief inside of our minds would prevent God from accepting us? Let's just say you have a person who's a child, right? You have a child who's of age. Do they know everything about the Trinity? Do they know everything about the resurrection? What kind of belief, when we think of belief, we think about knowledge. What kind of knowledge does God require to get them into heaven? Let's say if it's somebody who's mentally handicapped, what kind of belief does it require to get them into heaven? I've talked to lots and lots of people, conspiracy theorists, all sorts, who have some kooky, crazy, weird ideas inside their mind. They think of, aliens. I mean, real weird thoughts about aliens. And I'm like, is that going to prevent them from getting into the kingdom? And I'm like, so when we want to muddy, and this just becomes our, what we tend to think about. We got, should I believe in this? Do I have to think about this? What kind of right belief? And Jordan comes down to it. Do you believe in God? And he says, I act like there's a God. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, honestly, I think that's just what God requires. The love that says, I'm going to love you because you're a human being and that's what I'm required to do. I'm required to do it. Therefore, I'm going to make my bedroom. I'm going to make my bed. I'm going to do what I have to do. And then in some sense, that is the belief which God requires. It's the visible outward manifestation of what we truly long for being manifested in what we're doing. And when we say, well, you have to believe all the right things, boy, we're all damned.
For all of its weaknesses in movie making, Fireproof, if you've seen Fireproof, mm-hmm. with its love dare, there is a great truth at the center of that. You don't think you love your wife anymore? Well, start treating her as if you love her. And actually, that's basically what Lewis talks about in book 3 of Mere Christianity, which is very much based on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, that mm-hmm. virtue is a habit. The mm-hmm. more we act it, the more we become it. That's and right. Other books you were saying, Mark, the whole spiritual formation movement that came out of Dallas Willard and stuff. There's a lot of interest in those, but I'm trying to remember the names of the other writers in that. But again, trying to bring back, for Protestants, some of those disciplines, fasting and other things like that, is also a way. I mean, if you want to really challenge yourself, you can read Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, the old one from the late Middle Ages. Difficult, but the desire to grow in Christ and to continue moving forward. But like I said, Aristotle's got it all there.
and order your life, like you just said, order your life around the things you want to believe.
Right.
Yeah. Order your life around the things you want to be true. I think that everybody would say, despite, do you want Christianity to be true? Mm. And I think a lot of people would say, Well, yes, I do. I just can't believe it. Well, order your life around it being true, and you'll find that it is true in many different ways. And I think I would dare say you would even find it to be true if you start somewhere. The starting point is not, I have to believe everything right, like it happened exactly like it says it did. That's not the starting place. The starting place is take the first step is, just the first step. It's not this jump. I mean, we've created this chasm in terms of the scientific perspective of the world, this scientific understanding of the world in terms of evolution and this objective reality, which isn't my subjective, the narrative versus the objective, which Jordan is wrestling with. And you're like going, but sometimes they touch. And take those steps towards the touching and say, I want the world to be this way. I want people to act this way. I'd hope that there would be judgment. I'd hope there'd be a right, even if I don't necessarily believe there's a right and wrong. I would hope that there is a right and wrong. I would hope that there is meaning. Walk in that direction. Act as if there is meaning. Act as if there is right and wrong. And manifest in your life, be a symbol of the thing which you believe. And I think that's the making the bedroom is a great place to extrapolate out from. Start small, start there, and move outwards in increasing ways.
I would change it a little bit. I would say, those are exactly the key principles, it seems, right? It's attention, it's participation, and it's hierarchy. And so I think Jonathan put it best. He would say, instead of go clean your room, it'd be go to church and then clean your room.
That's good. That's good.
I thought that was that was exactly it, right?
Well, you all know that, we talked before, Lewis became a theist before he became a Christian. But when he became a theist, he started going to church, which was interesting. Even though he didn't really believe it fully, he started going to church, he said.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
And that's why I think Jordan Peterson offers the most, this halfway house to people. We in the West, particularly in America, in our evangelism, are still under the, are expecting this great leap from people, a great leap that's beyond what they can do. And if you just simply say, act like there's a God. And some people say, well, does that make me a hypocrite? No, you act like if you love somebody, you act like you love them. If you want to love God and you desire this world and you love the things that are them, then act like it's true. Live like it's true. And you're not being false. It's not a hypocrisy to simply live like you want something to be the case.
One of my friends and colleagues, who's also named Matt, he says that, this is the case with T.S. Eliot. If you asked him, he would not be able to tell you that he walked forward at an altar call or something. He'd probably look at you strange, but he lived as a Christian. He did all these things and certainly was, one of the great Christian intellectuals and academics and whatnot. And he probably would look at us strange.
Thanks. And I go back to Matthew 25, which we talked about a couple of times. Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. I find this very fascinating, and I think we've gotten it all wrong. And I'll tell you this: that we tend to think that the sheep are everyone who is under distress in jail, prison, all those kind of things that are in the world today. And we think of the goats as those who are we think of the brothers. We think of the brothers as if they're the ones in distress. They're any homeless person that you find. They're any sick person you find. They're any person in jail that you find. But in fact, Matthew defines who the brothers are early on in his gospel. If you take the gospel in its context, he defines specifically who the brothers are earlier on in the book. And Jesus says to him, it's the disciples. It's those who follow me. So if you take that understanding, when Matthew 25 happens, you've had the two parables before that, basically when the Son of Man comes. This third parable, so when the Son of Man comes, he will gather the nations or the Gentiles, the ethnos, basically everyone who's not a believer. He's going to gather all the rest. Right. He's going to gather all the people who never knew Jesus at all, because they asked the question, when have we ever seen you, Lord? They don't know Jesus at all. And yet he tells them, you see these people over here, my brothers, the people I identify with, if you took care of them, you took care of me. God judges them based upon their actions towards those who are connected with him. It's in essence just like the promise made to Abraham. In you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. So basically, if you operate, that's the now promise given to us, that if the non-Christians in the world treat us with dignity and with respect, help us in need, all those kind of things, then Jesus is not going to forget what was done to them. And it's about action. It boils down to action, and that action is considered faith. That action is considered right belief. Right behaviors, is considered orthopraxy, is considered orthodoxy. And I think that's exactly what Matthew's expressing, at least in the gospel there with Jesus' parable. So yeah, action and behavior, I think is we need to get back to that, because that's where meaning is found, is in embodied action, things that can be physically, visibly verified, and not something that's inside of our head that nobody has access to at all. So,
amen. Thank you, guys. It's been a real pleasure, as always, to speak with you all, and I look forward to doing more in the future if you're all willing. And I love these conversations, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.
I love how you've got a harp behind you. Isn't that the symbol of Ireland? Isn't the harp the symbol of Ireland? Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, that's my sister's harp. She's the talented one. She plays the harp, the piano, and everything. The most I could muster was the first Noel at Christmas, because she taught me. That was about it.
Great stuff.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Take care, all.
God bless you all.
See you later. Good to see you.